Hello everyone, we'll have a special type of episode today as I slept very little. I slept for 3 hours or so, and so we'll be playing something special today and listening to a very special video.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear that shape us, that provide us social support.
Yeah, already sucks what he says.
A huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to
Please
replace it.
cut off with the music. Big conversation, I doubt it'll be that fucking big. It'll be full of shit.
Welcome to the Big Conversation.
And very dishonest.
Part of Premier Unbelievable's roster of shows brought to you in partnership with the Templeton Foundation. I am your host, Andy Kind. Today we are talking about a very interesting topic. The question is religion good or bad for society? And I've been joined by two very dapper chaps, Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor, who most of you maybe will be completely aware of. We're going to have a very substantive conversation. I'm going to introduce them first. I'm going to give a little summary on who they are, and stop me if you've heard this before. So Ben Shapiro is a prominent American conservative political commentator and columnist. Okay, so far. A graduate in political science from UCLA and the Harvard Law School, Ben has authored over a dozen books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Right Side of History, How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. He is co-founder and editor emeritus of The Daily Wire and host of the aptly titled Ben Shapiro Show, which in 2021 was ranked in the top 10 most listened to Apple podcasts. He also has a YouTube channel with over 6 million subscribers.
Holy.
Kudos to you, sir. Joining Ben today is Alex O'Connor. Alex O'Connor is a YouTuber and host of the Within Reason podcast.
I feel so comfortable
philosophy
with
platform
2.2.
designed to present philosophical discussions in an accessible format. A graduate of philosophy and theology from St John's College, Oxford University, he is also an international public speaker and debater, having defended his philosophical convictions against a wide range of experts across multiple continents, and whose online video material has been viewed more than 70 million times. Is that true?
It might be more now, actually, depending on
more than 70 million times.
That was written.
Yeah, that was great. Well, it's great to have you both. Thank you both for taking the time. And for both of you, I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. So hopefully we're going to have a lot of good stuff to say. We're talking about religion and society and how they interconnect. And we want to know, really, and I'd like to get this settled once and for all at the end of this conversation, so nobody else ever has to discuss it if we can. Is religion good for society? Can a society hold together if there are no underlying beliefs that everybody shares? And we're going to be exploring what both of you believe are the most important principles undergirding any civilization. What are the foundations of morality and ethics based on? So, without further ado, let's start. I'm not going to go into backstory too much because most people will be aware of who you are. There'll be a lot of fanboys and girls out there watching. But let's talk about something that, Ben, you have spoken on, and Alex, you have responded to, this idea of the atheist delusion. Ben, could you
oh my God,
talk about what you mean by the atheist delusion?
Sure. So I should start off by saying I don't actually think that it's possible to prove the existence of God. I'm also not a believer that you can disprove the existence of God. I don't think that logical argumentation is going to get you there one way or another, and so I'm not going to try and do that with Alex today, because I think that if people have been able to provide dispositive proofs, then people would believe them, and if people were able to provide dispositive proofs that God does not exist, then people would be more apt to believe those as well. What I think is an atheist delusion is that it is possible to live ideologically purely in a way that does not rely on fundamental faith principles. When I say faith principles, I'm not going to make the claim that those faith principles are direct from Sinai, or that those faith principles require the New Testament, for example. I'm going to make the claim that there are a bunch of principles upon which we base ourselves that are external to what we know about nature and evolutionary biology, and that many other things that Alex does in his daily life, for example, are going to be things that rely on principles that are external to a philosophy that would assume a lack of the supernatural, a lack of the extra natural. So some of those principles, for example, are free will. So every day we get up, we believe, virtually all of us, whether we say we believe it or not, we actually act in ways that betray the idea that we believe that we have control over our own actions, at least to a certain extent, and that control makes a difference in the world. And that's what gives us purpose. It's what allows us to wake up in the morning and make the decision to do what we believe is right or what we believe is wrong. And the principles of right and wrong are external to evolutionary biology. So both of these principles that I've mentioned already, free will, right and wrong, these come from a language that is external to the Darwinian language of evolutionary biology. If you're talking about free will, there's nothing in nature that suggests the ability to make a decision free of environment and genetics in combination in some sort. The same thing is true of right and wrong, the idea that there is a right and there is a moral wrong, that we can reason our way to. Another principle that I think that you're obviously very big on, it's something that you rely on all the time, your entire podcast is based on the idea of reason. These ideas do not exist in the context of a purely materialist atheist universe. Now, I'm not going to make the claim that I can prove that it's God who's behind those things, because one of the principles of faith belief is that I don't understand God. So for people who don't believe in God, that's an easy way out, right? That's an easy way out for people like me, because I say, well, I don't have to explain the relationship between God and free will, because frankly I don't fully understand God. But that's not really
smart saying that at the very least.
That's not really an open window. That's just part of pretty much all faith systems, is that if my mind were the mind of God, then I would either be God or God would not exist, one of the two things. So the idea that reason makes a difference in our lives, that we can reason our way to propositions, and that's more than just saying a few magic words and that's setting off a few neurons in somebody else's brain in a naturalistic way, that there actually is principles of truth, another concept that comes from the extra natural world, that these principles exist. So far I've mentioned free will, good, right and wrong, reason, and truth, right? All things that we consider extremely key in our daily lives, and that Alex considers key in what he does. It's, I assume, why you get up every morning, or at least why you feel you get up every morning. You know, what gets you up to do your podcast? It's because you want to say things that you believe are reasonable, are going to convince people to act in a better way, or I assume not a worse way, that get people to change their lives in some way, in a self-motivated fashion. That's not merely in a sort of Pavlovian response to circumstance and environment. So if I were going to talk about the atheist delusion, that's what I would suggest is the delusion, that an atheist can use terminology that is drawn from a world that is external to atheism for itself. And again, that's not an argument for God even. That's just an argument against atheism. Again, I think the arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. This is one of the things that I said to Sam Harris. And I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
Well, something's certain. We don't do cold opens or soft starts here on the big conversation. Alex?
Well, I am glad to begin on a point of agreement with you, Ben, that yes, if there is no God, there is no free will, but I think that's because
Let's make a break.
The truth of the latter of those statements. That I suppose the biggest criticism that I've made of you in a video response that I made to the atheist delusion, and this show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So thanks again.
By the way, I should say it's a great video, and everybody should watch it if they haven't.
Well, I'm going to put that in the description. I think that's a glowing endorsement. The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle, or not so subtle, implication in my view that yes, with no God there's no free will, but somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence, such that in order to either say that there is free will, in order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God, and that does strike me as an argument for God's existence.
I mean, to slightly curve that, or to kind of stand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural. Sure. Now you can call that God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will. That is not possible. So I know that the way you solve that is that you say that there is no free will.
That's right.
And what I'm saying to you is you don't act that way.
I hear this all the time. People say, look, you may say there's no free will, but you don't act as though that's the case. I suppose that I'm just confused as to what it would look like for somebody to act as if they believe there was no free will. I mean, the very argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will, and that you are essentially just a biological machine reacting to its internal and evolutionary drives. That's what's happening. Now, call that nihilistic if you like, that's a separate question, but as to the question of how this would make one act, the idea that this might cause us to sort of lay around in bed all day or something, the very mechanism that I think is responsible for eliminating the possibility of free will, that is, the drives that make people do what they do, like I say, do exactly that. Make people do what they do. They make them get out of bed in the morning. Why do you get out of bed and go and make your breakfast if there's no free will? So you go and get breakfast because there's no free will and something is driving you to do that that's outside of your control.
For sure. So to get back to the nihilism point, which you kind of put aside, so that means that this conversation is essentially worthless in any sort of real sense. I mean, effectively, we were driven here by evolutionary biology and environment to have this conversation. Everybody who's watching this is driven by evolutionary biology and environment to have a particular reaction to that thing, and ever round the cycle goes. That seems like a very purposeless life. Maybe again, I'm drawing from a realm that is not evolutionarily biologically connected.
All right, let's
the word purpose is really, teleology obviously has been taken out of the realm of science pretty thoroughly by atheists and by many people in the sciences, although I would argue that, again, most scientists speak in the realm of teleology literally all the time, and they're borrowing language from the language of teleology, even when they're describing functions, particular body parts, right? The heart pumps blood in order to keep you alive, right? They're constantly using language that's teleological in nature. The real question that I have, and this is what goes to the question that you were asking at the beginning, before the sort of pre-question question, which was the good of religion to society. One of those goods is people believing that their free will matters, and this actually is a useful thing. So I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions and what biology would drive them to. So you say, well, it's biology that drives you to get out of bed in the morning, which is almost Calvinist in sort of the way that it's described, right? It's like you're predestined to get out of bed in the morning, so thus you get out of bed in the morning. But the reality is that we are constantly making decisions as though those decisions make a difference in the universe. And what social science actually does tend to show is that when people believe that they have control over their own actions, and when they believe they're capable of changing the way that they live, they do make those changes with more alacrity and in better direction than if they don't believe that. If people tend to believe in a deterministic universe, they do act worse. So it may work. This is going to be sort of Straussian in its implications, but that may work for you. You're a very high IQ individual who can somehow reconcile the idea of living a very purposeful life with the idea that actually there's no purpose to anything. But for the vast majority of people, that is not actually how they live. And I would suggest that even if you get out of bed in the morning thinking,
Alex, waste majority is fucking dumb.
Get on the bike, have a great day, the sun is shining, that's my biology doing this. And I don't think that most people who live purposeful lives, even if they believe that everything they're doing is predetermined by the world around them, by their own biology, I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Of course, but that's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide precisely that illusion. I mean, it's not as that. I mean, you say, look, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, gosh, look at my biological.
My neurons are firing. Yeah.
Of course not, because if I did, then the whole evolutionary purpose that this illusion serves would fall away. I mean, you say that this is a fairly purposeless life, and perhaps the implication is that it's a bit of a depressing one. I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the case.
By the way.
It is in fact the case that free will doesn't exist, and we may feel very nihilistic towards that, but as a wise man once said, facts don't care about your feelings. And I will say that the argument against free will, in my view, is based upon something broader than just scientific analysis or empirical research. Rather, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic, the proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. Now, this law of the excluded middle, one of the foundational...
Alex is pretty aggressive here. I mean,
philosophy,
not aggressive in a bad way.
We can simply ask a question of any kind of
He's
mental
pushing.
activity. And this will be regardless of whether it's material or immaterial. That's what makes this a crucial argument, and an important one, personally. is that you can ask of that mental activity, is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind, or inside your brain, or indeed inside your soul, or it's determined by something external to
It's
yourself.
so logical.
If it's determined by something external to yourself, I should say yourself rather than your brain here to rid this conversation of any implicit materialism, exterior to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? So indeterminate, it's random, determined, you keep going back until you either terminate in something outside of the self, something, or I suppose something undetermined and therefore random, either of which you are completely out of control. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this. They say, well, look, with a religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul. That doesn't solve anything, because you still need to. It's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery, but if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
Well,
so I would be careful.
That argument does rely on a complete deconstruction of the self. I mean, you're using the term self in this argument in, I think, a couple of different ways. You're saying something outside yourself, but then you're breaking down the self into a bunch of separate components, as though the self is a computer. Right? As though if you took the self and you broke it down into a machine, and there's like the microchip, you've got the processor, you've got all these different parts of it. So it has to be coming from here, or it has to be coming from here. But I think the very idea that we have of ourselves is as a deciding being. And so the attempt to carve that down into, so which parts of the deciding being, that is an avoidance strategy. And so I don't think that the argument quite holds.
Well, if we can call the self just a deciding being, then that sort of fundamental assumption that we make about the nature of the self, I don't think is going to be incompatible with atheism.
How so?
Let's try.
Because we're talking about what the self is. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms, as you've described. I see that your view of the self is an atheist view of the self, a meatball wandering through space, to put it somewhat colorfully. The sort of Spinoza idea that you're a stone that's been thrown, and you can comprehend that you've been thrown, but you're a stone that's been thrown, and that's just the way that it is. Why would there be in atheist philosophy such a thing as a deciding self? The deciding being, is external to the idea of an evolutionary cause, because the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision making, and you've just excluded it through your own philosophy.
Uncaused decision making. I suppose it's a concept that I think is unintelligible, and therefore, if there is an unintelligibility of the self on atheism, I suppose the thrust of the criticism that I made to essentially every point you made in that video, except for the argument from motion, is that what you're saying to me, if it applies to atheism, I think simultaneously applies to theism as well.
How so?
An uncaused decision. I mean, what is the process by which a decision is made?
But now you're falling into the same sort of argument that I excluded at the beginning, which was, I said that the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand. So I can't explain to you how the uncaused self makes decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheistic
But you have a
framework.
burden and I don't. Meaning that
I don't think that's the case.
You do. I mean,
he's so
the
pushing
simple
our
fact is that
line.
you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable materialist universe is the cause of all. And so, if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not. My entire philosophy rests on the positing of an entire realm of things I don't understand in terms of their interaction with the world. Now, as I said at the very beginning, that leaves me a giant escape hatch. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a giant escape hatch. It acts in practice as a giant escape hatch. It also tends to act as a fundamental principle of faith, right? Again, in every moral realm, right? When we get to the problem of good and evil, right? One of the big questions is, well, how can God allow evil to take place in the world? And the fundamental religious answer, as it has been for thousands of years, is my mind is not God's, which is a giant escape hatch. It also happens to be true from a religious point of view.
So if I may, there are two sort of escape hatches here. There are two appeals to mystery going on here. And it seems to me that what you're saying is something along the lines of my simple appeal to mystery here is disallowed in the way that you're allowed to appeal to this mystery because I'm the one making the claim. I think that in
not because I'm the one making the claim, but because
I'm the one with the burden.
Let's try.
In the context of this
sorry,
discussion,
I'm missing the
Yes.
who's the you and the who's the I in a sense, but yes.
I see what you mean. I'm speaking for myself there.
Sorry.
Oh, that's aggressive.
If in the context of this discussion, this began the subject which I think is the first one you bring up in this video, free will. Here's this thing that I think exists, and on the basis of its existence, think entails the existence of a god, or at least points to the existence of a god. I shouldn't say entail. And then, when I say that I don't think that the concept of free will is intelligible,
Oops.
and you say, well, how is it intelligible on atheism? And I say, I'm not sure it is, but it's not on theism either. And you say, well, there's my escape hatch. I can appeal to mystery. I don't think the burden is on me there. I think you are the one who's making the claim that free will does exist, that there is this mysterious property of the universe
Actually,
that
that's
escapes
not true.
this determined or indeterminate dichotomy. And then when I say that this is unintelligible to me, and based on what I see to be fundamentally appeal to a law of logic, suddenly I'm the one making the claim. I'm the one with the burden who has to do the proving.
No, the actual claim that I originally made, if you recall, was a conditional claim.
Oops.
I did not claim free will exists, therefore God. I claimed if you believe free will exists,
What?
it cannot exist in a materialist universe. Now, you say, okay, fine, it doesn't exist in a materialist universe. I don't believe in free will.
Yes.
That's fine. That's totally plausible. As I said right at the top here, I'm not going to prove to you that God exists today. What I am going to say is that the vast majority of people throughout nearly all of human history have believed there is a thing called a self. It is a deciding self that makes these decisions. If you are a person who believes that, you're right. It can't exist in your world. So, I'm not saying that it does exist. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're totally right, and all of this is just a series of chemical firings. That's quite plausible. That's fine. What I have said, and this is the argument that hasn't yet been rebutted, is that society does require an extraordinary number of people to believe that they are capable of making decisions for the good or for the bad. Because, again, not everybody is you. Not everybody is capable of waking up in the morning, putting one half of their brain on hold, the side that says what I'm doing today doesn't matter, and we are all going to wind up in the cosmic nothingness of space anyway, and the sun's going to explode and eat the Earth. Most people don't function that way, and so a functional society, a society that actually works, relies on people actually believing that their fate is in their hands. And the way that people tend to understand that on a day-to-day level is, I get up in the morning and I make a decision whether I'm taking my kids to school today. I get up in the morning and I decide whether I'm giving charity today. I get up in the morning and I decide whether to go to a job today. Because the truth is that for a huge number of people, and I would say this is true for virtually, not virtually all, many, I would say the majority of people, if they were informed since the time they were small that their decision-making process does not exist, there is no decision to be made. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Those decisions have no moral weight in the universe because the universe has no moral weight. There is no way to create a functional society on the basis of these premises. There may be a Platonic world where philosophers, can think about this in the gardens of their imagination and feel great about it, but that's not actually how society functions. Not for children, not for teenagers, not for adults.
Yes. We're going to go on and talk about that in the second section.
That's a bit tight.
I had free will to ask any of the questions I've had written down here, but I just didn't want to. I didn't want to stop either of you. It's been breathless and captivating. I'm sure you'll agree. Before we go to our first break, we are going to go on and talk about society and how morality undergirds society and civilization.
May I just say, I know we're coming to the end of the section. Just to close off this moment, that if people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here, And I don't mean that as an insult, but you see what I'm saying, right?
I totally agree. And so from my argument, you would be, and from your argument, I would be. Meaning, I think that you are delusional, there's no free will, and you think I'm delusional in the sense that there is no free will, and yet I believe in it.
Yeah. Something like that. Yes.
So for you, Alex, just before we go to the break then, because we're trying to break it down, we've got two insane minds here, really kind of grappling, and I feel as though I've won a prize in a competition just to be here sitting with you both. To break it down for the viewers, Alex, would you say that free will is maybe, if there is no free will, is it nevertheless a helpful fiction for people, a convenient narrative that we can cling to sort of bat away despair?
Precisely why it evolved, in my view. I think I totally understand that, but because it evolved so strongly, I will say that we are all, if we are sort of delusory in our belief in free will. I mean, you're quite right in saying that I act as if free will exists in the sense of not constantly being aware that it doesn't. I don't wake up and do those strange morning affirmations that you mentioned into the mirror about, the sort of death of the universe. But
but maybe you
but
should.
people, I think it is good to reflect on your mortality in that manner every once in a while, and it does inspire some serious thought about whether you're really taking your philosophy seriously. But I will say that the mechanism is so useful and has been so successful in embedding itself into our psyche that we cannot shake it off. So I can convince, I can have conversations with people, as I do regularly, talking about the existence of free will, and they come away saying, you know what, that's extraordinary, maybe you're right about this. And nothing about the way they live their life changes, precisely because of the fact that the very argument I'm making relies on the assumption that we will still be driven by our drives. All I'm doing is identifying what's actually going on there, in my view. It doesn't actually change what happens or what the brain indeed does.
So the utility argument for what you're saying about free will is that the main utility in you saying these things is for people not to believe you in the end.
We are predetermined to go to a break at this point. So we're going to continue this. You're watching and listening to the big conversation from Premiere Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kind. I've been joined today by Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro, and we are having a fascinating conversation about religion and whether it's good or bad for society. There's lots more to come, so we'll be back after this short break.
Who the fuck needed the break?
Welcome back to the big conversation from Premiere
Not so
Unbelievable
big.
with me, your host, Andy Kind. Today our topic is religion. Is it good or bad
Wait,
for
I forgot
society?
something.
And I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor.
Where is
In the first
I forgot
section,
to
we
turn it
basically
off.
solved the problem of free will. That's done. No one need write on that ever again. So congratulations. That's another credit for you.
Yeah, I think on the delusion point, we terminated in something like, I know you are, but what am I?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And my dad can beat up your dad's. So let's move on in this section to talking about another easily solved question, morality and its role in society. So, Alex, we started with Ben in the first section. Let's start with you. What for you makes an outcome good or bad? And feel free to break that down.
That's
and define
cool.
things
I
as
like
you want.
it.
And how do we determine what is good and acceptable in society?
Here is where I may disappoint you and potentially excite Mr. Shapiro in that I don't have a good answer to that question. In that, obviously attempts have been made for a long time to ground good outside of God. I must say that similarly to rehash the same theme, I think there are issues with grounding good in God as well. I don't think that removes the problem. I don't quite know what good is, if it indeed exists. I'm quite suspicious of the concept. I think it might be another one of these unfortunately quite nihilistic evolutionary sort of illusions of a sort. I guess I ascribe to emotivism more than anything, which has sort of gone out of fashion in the past decade, but I think still has some truth to it in a sense. It's more of a philosophy of language than it is a philosophy of what good and bad actually is. What I do know, however, is that there are problems with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect. That is, I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And what that means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those, inventions, and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on the planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God, there's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction, I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me. Because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe. Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates, allegedly, of the creator of the universe. It's all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults
that was not
of
bad.
nihilism and human invented with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
So many things there, and so much what you're saying is quite brilliant. I actually thought you were going in a different direction with that last example, which I'll explain in a second. So, to start with the very beginning, obviously, the idea of right and wrong. So there are many problems with emotivism. Alistair McIntyre does a good job sort of breaking down the problems with emotivism. But the sort of idea that there have to be certain moral absolutes that are beyond contention. And those moral absolutes have to be universally accepted. You can ground that, I suppose, in a sort of descriptive universe. The problem is that, to go back to your example, which again I think is a really interesting one, if a man comes to kill me, I think the real question of religion versus non-religion in the utility sphere here is it more likely that a man is going to come to kill you, being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you, or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing is wrong? So if you are faced with these two alternatives,
if you need a fucking God to understand that killing is wrong, you're more likely to fucking kill because you're fucking dumb.
Remove your example one step. The question is why the
I'm
man
not
has come
rational.
to kill you. Your premise is the man has come to kill you because God told him to, and so he can't be dissuaded by force. Agreed. We see that full scale in the real world on a fairly regular basis. It is also true that over the course of human history, men have come to kill one another on the basis of self-interest in extraordinary amounts of the time. Tribal self-interest particularly, having no particular relationship with God, just the idea that I want to kill you over territory, I want to kill you over resources, I want to kill you because you're not a member of my immediate kin family, or because you killed a member of my kin family, and so in revenge I need to kill a member of your kin family. The entire, to borrow from your language, the entire sort of evolution of religion on a utility basis would have been to create moral absolutes that are applicable more broadly than to you and your friends. Any morality that can be created on an individual level is inherently dangerous because you can immediately graft that morality onto your personal self-interest. The entire purpose of religion, whether you want to ground that in evolutionary brain functionings or whether you want to ground that in revelation, the entire purpose of religion on a utility level is to remove morality from the purview of my special interests and to say, here are things that I cannot do, even if they are in my interest, because there is a higher power that says I cannot do these things. I think that a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble. A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances, that are universally applicable, it reduces things that we all take for granted, like equal justice before the law, like the idea that the law is supposed to equally apply to everybody, whether they're a member of your family or whether they're not. And there are broad cultural differences in these questions. I mean, to pretend that all human societies have equality under law is obviously not true. It's not even remotely true, actually. There's a very good book called The Weirdest People in the World, all about the idea that we in the West have this sort of ethnocentric view of ourselves, where we think everybody thinks like people in the West, but the truth is that because we're Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, we have particular views of the world. Those views are drawn from a particularistic tradition. That particularistic tradition is biblical in nature. I mean, it is Judeo-Christian in nature, even if you're just describing European society or American society historically speaking. So the kind of removal of God from the equation, your suggestion is that God makes a person impervious to countervailing responses. And my answer is yes, God does make a person impervious to countervailing responses, including the evils of one's own heart, if you truly believe that God is standing above you, telling you not to do that thing. And again, social science tends to bear this out. People who believe that God is above them tend to give more charity, for example. People who tend to live inside religious communities, within the religious community. And I'm not going to pretend that I think all religions are equivalent in their truth propositions, because I don't. I mean, if I did, I wouldn't be wearing a yarmulke, right? So that's just what it is. Inside religious communities, a lot of social bonds and a lot of social frameworks are built on the basis of this shared belief system. In other words, diversity itself, self-interest, cannot always check self-interest, and it tends to tear apart societies and communities unless there is an orienting goal. That orienting goal traditionally has been performed by church. It's been traditionally performed by the idea that you are serving God together. And because of that, people build these social bonds, including the institutions of police, for example, to prevent people from killing each other, because we now all agree that killing is...
Yeah, to prevent people from killing each other now, rather to control them. So it's easier to kill them when they become an obstacle for the government.
Wrong, and so we ought to have a third party that we can actually give the power to stop that killing. So again, I think that the question of utility here is one of whether you think that the chief danger is that people are going to believe in a God who tells them to kill in God's name, or whether you think that the chief danger is in man's own heart, and that man is going to be driven by his own self-interest to commit murder and then call it something else.
I think it's all very well and good when this religious tradition is protecting what you think is good. But as we know, it can do the exact opposite, and it can do so with the same force.
Sure.
And I suppose the question we have to ask is whether this is a worthwhile trade-off. That is to say, you know, there may be some social utility in putting our fundamental ethical assumptions outside of the realm of debate. But when those ethical statements begin to inspire what we would probably consider to be less than socially cohesive behaviour, there is nothing you can do, nothing to talk people out of them, precisely because that's where they place them. And that seems dangerous to me. And it seems for example, you know, a lot of people talk about how religion can make people happier, it can make people more socially cohesive, it can promote people to start families and have children. This is true of most religions. This is also true of Islam, which I'm not sure you would want to say. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not sure you'd want to say is a force for good in the world. I don't think, in other words, that it's always a worthwhile trade-off. Now,
I agree with you,
just because you mentioned how the sort of culture of Europe and its success and America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent revival, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually,
he's good too.
actually, the great. I wonder what he would have to say. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about, you know, the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today, I'll expand on this if you like. A society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal, on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property, now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. As, you know, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man, rather she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, and that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the Sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution which he authored was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny if it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, so I would buy that, except for the fact that many of the people that you mentioned in these contexts explicitly counted themselves as religious believers and were speaking in the name of the religion while they were doing this. And take the abolitionist movement as an example. I mean, William Wilberforce, obviously a tremendously religious person and a big believer in the New Testament. Isaac Newton, obviously deeply ensconced in the New Testament, right? Yeah, certainly important to the scientific revolution. The point about religion, and this is why when I wrote my book, have some names that I don't know.
Alright, let's try.
You got to wave around.
Yeah, the right side of
camera.
history.
Nice
But
spam.
the reason that I talked about how reason and moral purpose made the West is because I think that one of the fundamental precepts of at least Judeo-Christian religion is that when God gives a text or a set of ideas to human beings, he expects us to use our reason to apply to those texts. And so the sort of evolution of interpretation is part of the religious tradition. I mean, that's always been the case in my religion anyway. So I can only, I always hesitate to speak on behalf of other people's religions because I don't know them nearly as well as I know my own. So when I talk about sort of the application of reason to tradition in the religious tradition, obviously we have books and books and books of texts discussing and debating these very ideas, and the idea of religious debate has always been central to the idea of Judeo-Christian religion, and when it hasn't been, it's been seen as repressive and has spawned then other Christian movements that then argue with the original movement and end up generating in almost Hegelian fashion some new form of interpretation. The point that I'm making is that outside that framework it doesn't exist, meaning that once, if the argument is over interpretation of particular biblical verses in a context in which there is a God who puts certain moral precepts beyond human judgment, those arguments you can have without threatening the entire social structure. What is very difficult is to have a social structure at all in the absence of fundamental moral precepts that are presupposed by everyone. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing a sort of revival of this idea that religion is very important to the West is because one of the things that we have seen is that as religion has become less important to the West, we've seen declining birth rates en masse. We've seen rises in suicidal ideation. We've seen,
and you think this is because of religion?
Individual atomization, certainly an extraordinary amount of less social connection. Right? All of these things are things that, frankly, used to be provided by church and these social institutions that, again, were oriented toward a single purpose. So when you talk about the idea that, I'm going to put aside the free will discussion because I think, again, it's easy to get caught up in the reversion to the argument that I was making before when you were saying that, can you argue the man out of stabbing you? To use your framework, I mean, you can't argue him out of doing anything. I mean, you're going to say words are going to have an impact. You can't argue him out of doing anything. But not to get back into a topic that we've handled. Free will is done.
I'm not gonna answer that. Although hopefully people will know from what I said before that I think it's still sensible to say you can argue somebody out of something. The first half of what you say there is in so many words, I think, what I was saying before, which is that yes, this goes both ways. That is, thanks be to God when he is able to provide us with the grounding for resisting oppression and throwing off tyranny. Yeah. But what about when the same God is used to justify the exact opposite? All I'm saying is that this goes both ways.
But you're going to have to weigh in one side or the other, meaning that in terms of utility. You're building a society. Let's say that I won't say you're God. Let's say that you are master of a society, and you get to build that society. One of the things that presumably you are going to do is you're going to build in certain things that are untouchable. Right? There's going to be certain moral precepts that you're going to build in that are untouchable. And how are you going to justify those things to people such that they are going to believe you? You're going to either have to use compulsion, or you're going to have to use some sort of other argument that is so strong that they are going to overweigh their self. I mean, there's a reason why Voltaire suggested he didn't believe in God, but he hoped that his maid did, so she wouldn't steal the silverware.
Yeah, that's an interesting indictment on the position that theists don't say that atheists can't be moral, right? When people have this argument about morality,
atheists can certainly be moral.
Well, oftentimes people have this misunderstanding of the argument. Christopher Hitchens did it best in saying, we don't need divine permission to be good and all of this. Fine, but as you say, you don't need to believe in God to be good, but you need to believe in God to ground that goodness. But then when you sort of casually throw in this statement by Voltaire, I don't believe in God, but I hope that my maid does. That implies that actually maybe you do think that without the belief in God, somebody isn't going to.
No, I think that Voltaire thought that he was good, meaning that Voltaire was an atheist and thought that he was good, but his point was sort of back to the Straussian Platonic point.
His point was that he hoped his maid believed in God because without that belief she wouldn't be able to.
Right. So because again, when we're arguing on the basis of broad societal utility, one of the things. So I happen to be in the happy position of being able to argue that what I think is socially useful also happens to be true. The question I'm asking you, and I think that's what a lot of this conversation is whether you think that what is socially useful is actually false or an evolutionary illusion. And I think that's kind of the position that you're taking, unless you want to argue that, generally speaking, religion is either not evolutionarily adaptive, which would be a hard position to actually take.
I think it must be, otherwise it wouldn't exist.
Or you would have to argue that it's even if it's adapted, it's of no general benefit to humankind or is an illusion, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's the position that you're taking. So one of the things that I'm enjoying about the conversation is that I don't think either of us are going to argue each other in anything, but it is clarifying what exactly the lines of the division are.
Yes, to backtrack a moment, because you said more than one thing in what I just responded to, you also mentioned, you talked about Isaac Newton being a Christian. So, I mean, people were astonished discovering his private notes to find that he spent more time talking about theology than he did science. This is certainly the case, but I do think it's worth pointing out when people like to notice that the originators of the scientific revolution in particular were believers in God. There are a few things to say on that. First, we don't know what Galileo thought in his heart of hearts, and part of the reason for that is because despite tripping over himself to say, now look, I don't think Scripture is wrong, now look, I believe in God, and I am a Christian, and I believe in Scripture, but maybe the Earth orbits the Sun, and his life falls apart. So suppose he did secretly have doubts about the existence of God. Do you think we'd ever have even found out about it?
And that's an unfalsifiable argument.
I think not a chance. In other words,
but the lack of falsifiability makes it difficult to make a counter argument.
In other words, let's not be so confident.
Maybe he did have a secret diary, but
in
I have
other words,
no proof that he had a secret
what I'm saying
diary.
is let's not be so confident about this. The second thing to say is that these men, if that's what they were remembered for, that is their theology, then they wouldn't be remembered. Thirdly, is that just on the minor point that people often like to point out that, well, the originators of the scientific revolution were religious, and so science can't conflict with religion. I'm not going to make the claim that science does conflict with religion in principle, but supposing that it did, this would not serve as a rebuttal, because if it were the case that the scientific revolution and the scientific method undermines religion, then of course the people who invented the scientific method would themselves have been religious, because they hadn't invented the mechanism by which it came to be undermined yet.
Yeah, but then afterward they presumably would be irreligious or a-religious, which is what happened to Darwin, for example.
It doesn't happen that quickly, right? It really doesn't happen.
At an individual level, it certainly
If we're talking about the development of the scientific method, we're not talking about the kind of thing that just happens in a lifetime. I mean, to attribute it to Galileo and Newton as we happily do is far too simplistic. This is something that happens over at least decades.
Right, but you're making both an individual argument and a broader historical argument. So pick one.
And so what I'm saying is that the individual beliefs of the founders of that revolution, I don't think that revolution would have gotten off the ground enough from just their contributions within their lifetime to shape decades of prior faith. However, when you get to someone like a Darwin, then we start to see agnosticism. Then we start to see people having their doubts. And then when you get into the modern era, atheism abounds. And so, in other words, if it were the case that this thesis, which, like I say, is not something that I'm defending here, I'm just sort of rebutting the rebuttal to it. That is, if it were the case that the scientific method were this king of undermining religion, then I think we would expect the fact that those who invented it to have been religious. It would be like saying, isn't it amazing that the person who invented the motor car didn't own a motor car before?
Well, no, because, again, you've now also made the case that perhaps they had secret diaries, or in their heart of hearts they weren't actually religious or convinced away from that. So again, that's why I'm saying I feel like you're making a broader historical argument that works, and I think you're making an individual argument that doesn't quite.
I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying that we would never know because why is that? Why will we never know what Galileo really thought about religion?
Well, I'm going to just accuse you of assuming facts, not evidence. I mean, like,
let's move it away from
because again, you're, like, I don't want to get into the mind of Galileo, nor do I care very much. But the reality is that many of the people who were the progenitors of the scientific revolution, participants in the scientific revolution, specifically were searching for something higher because they thought that was their godly duty to do so. I mean, this has been true since the time of Roger Bacon. I mean, the idea that you have people who are specifically seeking out the nature of the universe, because there's an understandable, again, another religious precept, there's an understandable universe that God has created, and your mind is a reflection of certain truths that are in that universe. These are all non-materialist atheistic concepts. That was the basis for virtually all of science, including the origins of the scientific revolution. Now, you can make the argument very easily. I mean, I make it all the time because I have to metaphoricalize the beginning of Genesis, for example, that the words of Genesis don't jibe with the words of science when it comes to the age of the universe, for example. And obviously that's true, which is why both Maimonides and Aquinas are talking about in the Middle Ages the idea that if science comes into conflict with religion, you're either getting one of them wrong or you're getting both of them wrong. And so the constant sort of reinterpretation of religion in light of the facts that are established by the scientific method, I don't think that's a rebuttal of religion. And so and more than that, I think that the peculiar idea that religion itself must fundamentally be undermined by scientific discovery, I don't see quite why.
Well, I would agree with that. I'm just saying that the rebuttal that's presented to that opinion fairly commonly, I don't think works for the reasons that I've said.
Okay, well let's give you both a little breather, because we're going to go to another break very shortly. We've fitted in so much, and I had all these questions, and I haven't asked any of them. And I'm worried now that I'm going to be left unemployed.
Before we move on, I don't know if I can have one final word on this Galileo point, because I know it seems quite strange that I'm sort of hypothesizing in this way, but you said that when religion and science come into conflict, either one is wrong or both is wrong. Galileo was wrong about one of these things potentially. What happens it's great talking about the utility of his religious belief in inspiring his scientific endeavor, but what happens when the immediate fruit of that is him discovering something which should have been a celebrated idea and instead was suppressed, and he ends up under house arrest in Tuscany for the rest of his life? Why? Specifically because the religious authorities, in their sentencing of Galileo, did not just say that he failed to prove it, did not just say that he was, being a bit of an a-hole in his approach to things, but said specifically because it is false, absurd, and contrary to Scripture. That is why that scientific position was suppressed, and specifically religious motivations.
And far be it from me to defend the Catholic Church and its crackdown in Galileo. You come to the wrong place for that.
Okay, it's time. It's time for another break here. You are watching and listening to the big conversation from Premiere Unbelievable. I am almost anonymous here, and be kind, but my day will come. And I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. We'll be talking about religion and society. Is religion good for society? So much more still to talk about. We'll see what we can fit in. We will fit as much as we can, but we'll be back
Not
after this
fucking
short
bad.
break. Enjoying the conversation? Tell us who persuaded you in our survey, and do part 3 of the big conversation from Premiere Unbelievable. Today we are
this is
discussing
interesting, but
religion.
this is
Is
quite
it
boring.
good or bad for society? And
I should
we're
add,
having a lot of
like,
fun with it, I think. I mean, I
I
know
should
you're-
maybe
I know
make
you're
it
sort
like
of in
70.
disagreement on things, but I think we're just having
Add
fun with it today, aren't
a
we?
little portals, maybe.
I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and
And
Alex
yeah, and
O'Connor.
add fucking
And
spikes.
as I say, we're talking about religion and its role
Let's try
in
that.
society. One observation I've got from
Oh, they're
watching
small.
you guys talk, I wonder whether religion is being used as a bit of a catch-all term. There is no summer festival where Ben and
No.
I would meet up because we're religious and have a beer together. Plenty of Buddhist people don't even believe in God, so we probably don't have the time to unpack it now, but religion is maybe not a helpful catch-all term at all points. I wonder whether, when we're saying religion in this
Not bad.
context, we mean the Judeo-Christian worldview. But it's interesting, I, as a Christian, there's lots of things I agree with Ben on, some things I disagree on. Lots of things, as an Englishman, that I agree with Alex on, and other things that I wouldn't.
Spelling.
So yeah, spelling, absolutely. It's aluminium. Anyway, I just think that's interesting. I'm not trying to start this theist gang and gang up on Alex at all. But what do you think quickly about that? When we're talking about religion, do we need to be more semantically sort of accurate?
Rigorous, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, again, I'm not here to defend every form
Alright,
of
that's-
religion
that's
under
a
the
bit
sun.
hard. Let's
there are
try
various forms of religion,
again.
ranging from things that people in Judeo-Christian tradition would consider pagan,
Let's add speed
to
changes,
Judeo-Christian
light,
monotheism,
start speed
to the distinctions
3.
in Judaism and Christianity, which are substantial, obviously. And so, I do believe that there are right forms of religion, or righter forms
Let's
of religion
remove.
than others. If I didn't, then I wouldn't be a particularist in my religious practice or my religious belief. And so I do think that you're right to sort of boil down the question so that people don't end up defending things or being forced to defend things that they wouldn't defend. When you mentioned before Islam, I'll say more radical forms of Islam, because again, I'm one thing that I tend not to do as a religious believer is simply take people's texts at sort of face value, because the reality is that very few people in religious circles take their text at like I can just pick up a Bible, read it, and now I know everything that's going on in the Bible value. That really is not how the practice of religion works. I tend to actually judge faith by faith practice more so than I do by trying to read somebody else's book and then figure out exactly what they're saying, because I've seen people do that enough to my religious practice to sort of object to it. But yeah, of course, I think that you would have to talk, if you're going to talk about the value of religion, you should be more specific. I will say that the value of religion more generally, if you were going to talk about it in just general terms, meaning belief in supernatural things that can't be
I
explained
forgot
by
that there
a
are
materialist universe,
speed changers.
the social cohesion point would be the best case in favor of religion, is that virtually every study ever done has shown that social cohesion relies on a common orientation among people in order to build commonality between people. There are really only a few structures in human history that do that. One is the kinship structure. The problem with kinship and tribal structures is that they pretty quickly devolve into tribal warfare upon other members of different tribes. One of the things that religion has done is in an attempt to universalize that beyond the immediate sort of tribal self-interest that we discussed a little bit ago. And again, pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear that shape us, that provide us social support, that provide us friendship structures, marriages, that a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been
nothing fucking else.
So the sort of breakdown of those structures, you could make the case, I suppose, for the breakdown of those structures, but there's been pretty much no replacement for those structures in secular society, and it's creating some pretty significant strains on societal bonding.
Right. So I do have two things to say. I'm going to ask you, I want you to say both of those things, but I want to ask you, Alex, can secular societies potentially achieve the same level of social cohesion as religious ones?
Potentially, maybe. I don't know. That seems to be an empirical question, insofar as we can have empirical data on social cohesion as a subject. I wanted to, I suppose, in response to that question, mention the history of the United States as a constitutionally secular nation. Presumably the discussion there devolves into whether America can be described as a Christian nation or not. But based on what you just said a moment ago, before we maybe get into that, you said, of course, we need more specificity is hardly ever worse than less, and that you're not trying to defend all religious traditions. And then you say, but look, this idea of there being a God and there being an unalterable authority and a moral order of the universe is itself valuable, and without it, there are all kinds of societal discohesion comes about. In that case, for example, I wonder, and I hope it's not a crude question, and it's one stemming from genuine.
That was unexpected.
Your child comes to you and says, I think I'm going to convert to Islam, or said, I don't think I believe in God anymore.
As a Jew, I'm fairly indifferent on the question, meaning that my priority is for my child to remain a Jew, and which direction they go from there is of much less interest to me than staying inside the religious tradition that I believe is correct.
Okay, maybe I should rephrase to say, suppose that half of the U.S. population immediately, right now, and half of let's say half of the Christian population. So it's not to do with Judaism, and it's not to do with your own family. Half of the Christian population in the United States are immediately going to convert today to atheism if you press this button, or to Islam if you press this button. Which one?
So I can ask for more specificity in line with the conversation. So which form of Islam are we talking about, and which form of atheism are we talking about? Because they come in various strains, but meaning like
really. He left.
Starting from the premise of no God or Islamic God, that actually is not enough information, because as I say, I'm not judging people based on their faith propositions nearly as much as I am based on their behavior, which I think they base on faith propositions.
Well, let's say this is the only thing that changes. You press this button, half the Christian population become convinced that there is no real God of the universe. Everything else is random. Whatever you might, because what we're discussing here is essentially what are the implications of such a worldview. What are the implications of atheism, which is just the disbelief in God, or the belief that there is.
People have memories. In this hypothetical, do people have memories, or they don't have memories? Because this makes a difference.
They have memories.
Okay, fine. So then probably in the West, atheism, as opposed to a more radical form of Islam, if I was asking for specificity.
Well, the button on the right-hand side was going to be that they just become convinced that Muhammad is the final prophet of God.
Right, and again, I was going to ask for more specificity on that, because I know many moderate Muslims who are not radical in the implications of their faith,
of course.
as opposed to some who very much are quite radical in the implications of their faith. So, but let's, if you don't mind, I'm going to set up your hypothetical in a way that I think is more clarifying for me anyway, and that is button on the right is radical Islam, like Taliban-style Islam. Okay. And button on the left is don't believe in God.
Well, I mean, you can do that.
The reason I'm doing that is because that elucidates a difference that I think is being obscured by the simple sort of belief in God, not belief in God question, meaning that the cultural heritage of that's why I asked if people have memories or people don't have memories. If people have memories, then that looks very much like secular Europe right now, which does have
the cultural
in the bloodstream a lot of Judeo-Christian values in a way that would not be true if you were without memory. Right? Would I rather that a child found in a forest be raised in a moderate Muslim household, or be raised in a secular communist household?
Or a secular atheist household, if I may say.
Again, from which tradition? Are we talking in the USSR, or are we talking in Britain? What are we talking?
We're talking about Britain.
Okay, so we're
we were talking about the US, but let's say Britain.
In Britain, depends on the strain of Islam. If we're talking about like a liberal form of Islam, which do exist, and probably
liberal Islam.
If we're talking about a fundamentalist form of Islam, then
gosh, liberal Islam.
Probably a secular strain of Britain.
Fine. The second point was to say, I mean, you mentioned not wanting to just take scripture at face value, and I understand the difficulty of taking scripture essentially out of context and trying to take a literal approach where a literal approach isn't supposed to be taken. I mean, people forget that the Bible is a collection of books rather than a book with lots of different
with an oral tradition and all that.
I saw a video once of somebody trying to use the Bible to disprove the divinity of Jesus by quoting the book of Job, saying, "God is not a man that I might question him." God is not a man, you see, and I thought not only is this in the mouth of Job, but also that's the kind of thing that we want to avoid. But it does seem to me that there are some things within religious scripture that do need to be taken seriously and do need to be taken essentially at face value. That is some of the very specific legalistic commandments of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. These are not. When people list these and say that these are potentially morally problematic and may have done something towards hindering, for example, like I mentioned earlier, the abolition of slavery in the United States, of course, there's a great deal of religious influence on both sides, which is something that I've already mentioned. But don't you think that this problem could have been solved a lot more easily if there had been a stronger religious tradition of opposition to the ownership of other human beings? Why can't that have been the case?
Okay,
because
so
Scripture quite explicitly
what can you do to like
and in fact gives you the details of how to do
maybe
it. So that's something that couldn't have been done.
8,000 meters.
Now I get to do Talmudic law. So
this moral
here's
principle that's placed outside of meaningful debate.
Right. Before we move on, can I ask, where are we getting these buttons from? Are they from Amazon? You know, you press one and everyone's an atheist.
There's this wonderful thing
Are these available on the market?
That I think you both need to use in this conversation, which is imagination.
Oh, right.
So let's as far as why didn't the Bible prescribe the way that I would see it, or that you might see it? And the answer is because two reasons. One, as stated right up top, I'm not God. I assume he has different logic than I do. Two, the Bible is in an inherently problematic position in the sense that, on the one hand, it's trying to divulge important truths for all time. At the same time, it's talking to a people of a particular time. Yeah. And this is a well-worn tradition inside Judaism. So to take the slavery example, there is no mandate to hold slaves in the Bible. There are lots of mandates in the Bible. Many, many mandates. There's 613 of them according to my religion, right? That's why I do all these weird things that I do. But one of those mandates is not to hold slaves. And so the idea of there was a society that existed at the time of the Bible in which slaveholding was not only ubiquitous, it was universal, and which was true for virtually all of human history.
That's right. And
could be justified not just in terms of religious scripture, but in terms of Aristotelian thought, right? I mean, the great philosophers we like to cite in sometimes in the secular tradition are big fans of slavery, and that's true virtually up until the 18th century.
Yeah.
So the idea would be, is this verse attempting to woo people away from a tradition of slavery or to humanize the slave? Or is it attempting to reinforce that by making it harsher and more difficult? And that's why actually one of the things I enjoyed doing in terms of how I study the Bible, for example, is I like to look at contemporaneous religious texts of the time. So I like to study the Bible alongside, for example, Hammurabi's Code. And it's really interesting to notice the differences and where the Bible is liberalizing Hammurabi's Code, for example.
Absolutely.
And so the idea that a divine revelation has to be given to human beings who are capable of following that in the time. Again, that's part of the difficulty of I think rebutting religion in a certain sense, because again, it seems wiggly, but it really isn't, in the sense that if you believe, as I do, in a God who spoke to human beings in some form or fashion and has to speak to them on a level that they can understand, in ways they can understand, then that immediately is going to discount the ability to do a lot of very radical things that would have appeared radical in 1200 BC, but now appear to be commonplace for us.
Yes, I understand this argument, and I've heard it many times. I must say that it seems strange to me that God does seem willing to completely and utterly condemn a bunch of other practices, including, by the way, imaginary crimes like witchcraft, just done away with entirely. And even if it is the case that God, for some reason, couldn't even hint at the idea that maybe eventually we should be moving towards the abolition of the idea of owning human beings as private property, he just has to condemn it. I still think it's the case that he would not permit a flat immorality, and I think you would agree with that too. And so when I open the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and when I look at the texts saying that if you lay siege to a city, you can kill if the Lord delivers it into your hand, you can kill the men and the women, but you can kill the men and keep the women and the children and the livestock as plunder, as Deuteronomy says, and in the very next verse, the very next chapter says that if you see a good-looking woman, and I'm not interjecting that, if somebody finds an attractive woman, then they can take them for themselves, and if they want them as their wives, then they take them home, they shave their head, they cut off their fingernails, they give them 30 days to mourn their old husband, who you may very well have just killed, and then you can take them as your wife. When Numbers 31 has Moses instruct the slaughter of the Midianites, saying, kill all the men, and this time the women get killed too, but not the women who haven't slept with a man. And why might that be? And it says that keep them for yourself. And I hear all the time that this is some kind of liberalising process. Maybe it's because these people wouldn't survive on their own. It's some kind of protective measure to make sure that you're looking after them. If that's the case, then why does it only apply to the virgins? That seems a little bit suspect to me. It's sort of Scripture is littered with these kinds of.
Well, again, so to go back to the sort of oral tradition nature.
I don't think God would permit a proactive immorality, even if he can't, for some reason, abolish the practice altogether. If you see what I'm saying.
No, that last point I don't see. So when you say even if he can't abolish the practice altogether,
which already I think he would be able to do.
Right. So the question is whether he can or whether he can't. If he can't abolish the practice, then the idea of wooing people away from a particular type of sin through a gradualistic process is known throughout societies across human history. I mean, gradualistic processes are the way that most things get done across human history. And by the way, the universal practice, unfortunately, up till today in many places in the world, is in fact the extreme version of what you're talking about. Raise everything, kill everyone. That sort of stuff, unfortunately, does take place, even on planet Earth, even in the year 2023. And so the idea of a culture arising from the Bible that not only abolished slavery on its own terms, but then abolished slavery literally everywhere else, which is what Great Britain did. That, again, to separate that off from a tradition that also says that every human being is made in the image of God, right, from Genesis, or that you have to treat the stranger well, right, which is repeated more than any injunction in the Bible. Right? There are these traditions that are at war with each other inside the Bible, which is why there is this hotly fought kind of argument inside biblical circles about all this stuff, which again is one of the reasons why I said right up top that when it gets to I can't just open the Bible and interpret the text as I would see fit. You say, well, I don't like this verse right here.
Contradictory?
What is that?
You say that Scripture is contradictory?
Well, I say that Scripture is some Scripture is time bound and some Scripture is not. So the easy one, the sort of easy way to distinguish is that when the Bible says not to do a thing, then that tends to be non-time bound.
And when it says to do a thing.
And when it says to do a thing, that may be a temporary permission structure, but it could also be a wooing. And by the way, again, I'm not speaking out of turn here. This has been 1,500 years of Jewish reinterpretation of Ancient Torah. To take a quick example, right? The war bride, the long-standing Talmudic tradition, which again is almost 2,000 years old at this point, is that was deliberately an attempt to avoid mass war rape. Which again, you can scoff at that, but mass war rape happened on this continent 70 years ago when the Russians literally raped everyone as they came into Germany. So these evils continue to exist in the human heart.
Even if this
that happens in Ukraine,
this was a liberalizing force, and even if this was not as bad as other slavery, do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God commanding something which you now see to be, or rather permitting something and explicitly and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
Because permitting, it's not permitting me, permitting my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather to do something
immoral.
That in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
right.
But was it immoral? Now,
who's the
what? Oh my God.
By the Judeo-Christian tradition, sure. By today's standards developed under the Judeo-Christian tradition, immoral.
So
which, by the way, you're living off the. You're again, not to get back to the Tom Holland argument. You're living off the remains of this. I mean, where's your morality coming from?
But who's the moral relativist now? I mean, it seems that a moment ago you say that the great success of religion is providing a sort of untouchable moral basis that sort of transcends human affairs and human debates. And now when I say, well, look at this, open your own religious scripture and look at this blatant immorality, you say, yeah, but well, that was considered to be fine at the time. It's considered to be bad now by the progressive Judeo-Christian values. Who's the moral relativist?
Well, it's not relativistic to say that a thing that is wrong today is considered wrong today because of a tradition that developed over time.
The question I'm asking is not, was it considered right or wrong at the time of biblical slavery?
Was wrong.
Was it wrong?
It was wrong then to hold a slave. Yes, it was wrong then to hold a slave, obviously. And also, if you are God and you are pragmatically attempting to woo people away from slavery, was it a practical thing to simply quote-unquote
Now
abolish
it's fucking
slavery?
bad.
Or is that
Here's an idea,
a
for
religious
example.
tradition?
In the book of Exodus, God says, I think in chapter 21, maybe 22, it says
You're cooked,
that
Ben.
if you have a Hebrew slave, you're to let them go after 7 years. If that Hebrew slave comes to you with a wife, then after the 7 years, you let them go free. If you give the Hebrew slave a wife, and they have children, then after those 7 years are up, you give the man a choice. He can go after the 7 years, as per, but you keep his children and his wife. Or, and here the scripture says, if he says, I love my wife, I love my kids, and my master, as if that's going to be one of the principal considerations, then he can stay with you, at which point you take him outside, you pierce his ear like cattle, and he becomes your property for life. Now, here's a suggestion, for example. If it was already established that Hebrew slaves go after 7 years, and it's already established that if they come with a wife, they can go after 7 years, then if I give them a wife and they have children, would it not be, it doesn't seem to me particularly revolutionary. It doesn't seem to me the kind of thing that would have caused such social discohesion that God just couldn't have found a way to do it. To say, well, why not let the whole family go free after those 7 years? With the knowledge beforehand that if you give this Hebrew slave of yours a wife and children, they'll get to leave with them. That seems to me, for example, a minor improvement that would not cause this kind of revolutionary, earth-shifting, he couldn't have just gotten away with slavery. Maybe that's true. But something as obvious as this to me, it seems that if that is the case, that could have easily been done, then the failure to do so, and the keeping of that Hebrew wife and their children as the master's property,
Let's
that
try
itself
making
becomes
it
an
500
immorality
meters.
that is dictated.
If
from
I
the
agree with your
heavens.
premises, I agree with your conclusion. I think that the question as to how much social disconnection would cause to do a thing is an open question. I think the other question that sort of remains open here is the incentive structure as to whether you accept a wife from your master. Right, so I don't want to get into the obscure. I mean, literally all day. There's 70 volumes of the Talmud that are literally about this sort of stuff, and then Hopia's writings in terms of reinterpretation.
Yeah,
of
we're
this
hardly
sort
the
of-
first people to talk about it.
Where are my
It's not the
speech
first time these
changers?
questions have come up.
Fuck.
But I think the general point is sort of one where either we can dive into that full time and you can spend your life becoming a rabbi, which
Could
enjoy.
happen.
You
Never say
have
never.
the beard for it. It's your beard is further along than mine.
Oh, shit.
Or we can sort of stipulate at the top that there are certain biblical interpretations that are abstruse and difficult, and that that has been a reality of religious life since the beginning.
Well, I can agree with that.
So we need to step from the past into the future through this conversational portal that we've got available to us. Obviously, everyone at this table would agree that holding a slave is wrong, in the same way that the man you kept talking about, who you
Speak
thought
for
was guilty,
yourself.
we would all agree
Ben
that that's a
Shapiro would
problematic
like
thing.
himself a slave.
And
I
it
believe.
does seem, so I'm not going to get you to defend this, I want you to come up with another game show where you solve the future problems of society for us. It does seem that on an atheist worldview, it is difficult ultimately to say what is good, what is right, what is wrong, but we can be practical about it, we can be functional about it. So
No,
come on then,
that
for the
was
future,
a good attempt, potentially.
give us some practical secular philosophies that can really help to build social cohesion for the future. You've got about a minute to do that, then we'll give Ben a minute to respond,
Well,
and then we'll wrap up.
I can provide an answer that I don't think will be cause of further debate, which is to say,
That'd be shocking.
Yeah.
I think everything that I've heard you say, Ben, on this subject, and everything that I think you may be about to say, not everything, but some of it, involves saying that look, what we need to do is encourage strengthening family and having children and not doing drugs and all of this kind of stuff, which people, like you say, have traditionally this has been somewhat the prerogative of the church to maintain. I think that people just don't believe in God anymore, and so what I would say is just to encourage those things without the God. The question I would leave, and I'm sorry, I've just promised no debate, but here's something. Look, suppose it's the case that I agree wholesale with your proposition that religion is good and maybe even necessary for society in some way.
Oh, no.
Suppose I just say that that's true. I don't believe it's true. I've tried, I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. And so, I'm now left with a choice here. I don't think it's true, but I become convinced that it's somehow useful or beneficial. What am I to do with this information? You can't just choose to believe in God. People say you can choose to act as though you believe in God. That's kind of true until something really testing comes along. If you don't really believe it in your heart, you will falter at the first opportunity. How am I to raise my children? Am I to lie to them? Am I to say, well, I don't believe this nonsense, but because I think it, promotes a sort of non-replacement, birth rate, then I'm just going to bring them up believing things that I think are false. I don't think this can happen. It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question, that outgo the idea of being, truthful and being honest and talking about things that you think are philosophically sound. Now it's essentially faith-based, and it's about trying to make as many people, the greatest good for the greatest number across society and societal cohesion, even if you think it's false. In other words,
that was a very dumb fail of me.
I'm someone who is an atheist. I don't believe it's true. If I just grant everything you said about the utility that religion provides, what am I to do?
So let me.
You've got about 30 seconds.
So I mean, it really it's a quick question, which is, do you know it's not true, or do you not believe that?
What's the fucking difference?
You believe that it's not true, or you don't believe that it's
I
true?
believe that it's not true.
You believe that it's not true in a full fashion.
Let's say that's the case. Yeah.
Right. So if you believe that, then obviously I think that you're wrong in the sense that, as I said right at the outset, I think that a lot of atheists are more religious than religious people. Religious people constantly admit to doubts and problems in interpretation and all the rest of this sort of stuff. I don't think that a true religious believer can be truly religious without experiencing those doubts, because you're taking a leap of faith right off the top. And what I would normally say to somebody who is not fully committed to disbelief, I would say, is that you'd be in the position of being able to say to your kid, I don't know if it's true or not, which I think is a more honest answer, by the way. And I think that is something that you can teach your kids. You can say, here's an atheist perspective, here's a religious perspective. I don't know what's true. I can provide you evidence on my side why I don't believe it fully, but there are people who provide evidence on the other side and arguments on the other side that are not foolish, that are not out of the sky crazy, and make your own decision. I think that's the way that you would address that with a child. If you're somebody who believes in the social utility of religion but doesn't necessarily believe in the religion itself, I think giving the child the ability to choose that themselves by saying I'm not sure, or by presenting both sides of the argument, would not be a bad way to go. I mean, just in terms of practical solutions. In terms of what I would say to better society, I have a much easier answer, which is I think that you should re-engage with your social institutions, including your church. I think that saying to people on an individual level, don't do drugs, study hard for your tests, get married before you have kids, get a job, like it's easy to say that to people, and I think that without supporting social institutions that reinforce that nearly every day and make it part of the culture that surrounds you, it's very difficult for people to live that. And so I think that removing God as sort of the capstone of these institutions, the whole institution tends to fall apart. So on a practical level, if you get rid of God, the institution just ceases to exist, and you can yell as much as you want, but individuals are far less likely to provide the social reinforcement and social networks of support that actually create the bases of a good, fundamentally solid civilization, and an individualist civilization in which all you can do is basically encourage someone to quote-unquote do the right thing.
Amen. Well, the fact we've managed to keep Ben Shapiro within the 24 minutes is a miracle in itself, a miracle that Alex doesn't believe in.
Oh, no.
But we have been talking today on the big conversation about religion and whether it's good or bad for...
It's not honest and respectful from Ben Shapiro's side. That's true. Is there anything else? I'll listen to this.
You debated Ben Shapiro yesterday. How did that go? I haven't even seen you.
It went well. I think it will probably be out around the time of this interview, maybe slightly before, slightly afterwards. It was a good conversation. We were discussing whether or not religion is good for society. And
some stance for young Benjamin to take at the moment.
I suppose so. I mean, it was a very much sort of don't mention the war type scenario. I mean, the producers had said that we want this to be an evergreen conversation. We want this to be something that people can listen to at any point. And also, Ben had just the night before been to the Oxford Union, and I haven't seen that yet either. But it sounds
I saw that
like
he had at it with a bunch of people on the other side of the fence.
Yeah, he didn't have a very good time. He said to me that it was the most tense thing that he's ever done. The most tense thing he's ever been a part of.
Well, I saw something that was kind of interesting was the video was only shot on what appeared to be iPhone.
Yes.
So there was no... Maybe they just wanted to get it early as opposed to waiting for the Oxford Union's official video to come through.
Seems to be the case. They do seem to be planning to upload it. In fact, when I was recording with Ben, I think his team were in the green room sort of furiously subtitling to try and get it out, potentially before the Oxford Union.
Right, yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, it sounded like a hell of an evening. And so the next day, he was saying that it sort of felt like a nice break from that.
What, to sit opposite you?
Well,
that you are the comfortable leather pair of shoes that he can put on.
I think Ben relaxes in argumentation. I think he genuinely enjoys it. I think there's no contradiction to say that he was having some time off by sitting there and having a spat. But he was having a break from the politics.
Right.
In other words, he was able to just argue about something a bit more perennial and a little less fiery, I suppose.
What have you learned? So you are... I've been a massive fan of you since before you came on the podcast, and since then we've become friends, and you've come out to see me in Austin, we've spent a ton of time together. You're probably my favourite person to watch debate people, because it's kind of a little bit like watching Batman versus Spider-Man or something, because I know you well, and we've argued a lot, but I know maybe Ben Shapiro, but I don't know what will happen when these two people come together. You were president of SOC.
Debating Socratic Society, yeah.
Yeah, you were part of Debate Soc and all of this other stuff at Oxford. Given that you've got a relatively illustrious heritage of both formal and informal debates, what is your assessment of Ben Shapiro's debating style, his ethical consistency, his ability to deploy logic, etc., now that you've gone mano a mano in the ring?
Well, he has obviously an incredibly high verbal IQ. He can construct a sentence out of nowhere and do it very quickly. And he's also very difficult to interrupt. Not that I particularly wanted to. I mean, he would throw sort of maybe 2 or 3 points out at once, and you want to butt in and do them one by one. You don't want to be rude, of course, so I let him finish. But it was amazing how they just glued together into one wall of text. You know, I've seen comments on some of the videos that I was watching of him in preparation to talk to him, where people were not being funny in saying that they play the video on 0.75 speed, because it makes him sound normal. There was sort of an episode with Constantine and Francis, trigonometry, and he's talking about religion and its relation to the fentanyl crisis, and people were saying that and it was very fast. If you play it on 0.75, you forget that you've done that, and you're just hearing somebody talk at a normal volume, at a normal speed, and then Constantine comes in sounding like a blue whale or something out of nowhere. So he's very quick. Yeah. But also, I thought, very charitable. This is the thing. I think people get Ben Shapiro wrong. I went to his Cambridge Union event after this discussion / debate, because it was in Cambridge. That's why we were out there, and so I went to this event, and I was talking to a lot of the students afterwards. And you hear a lot of people saying about Ben Shapiro that he's a bit of a grifter, or well, I'm not really a fan. Or you have the sort of secret fans who are sat in the chamber going like, well, you know, it's. I think it's important. You know, if you're going to disagree with someone, you sort of have to hear the thing that you disagree with in the flesh. And it's like, so you can say that you like Ben Shapiro. It's okay, you know. But people see this side of him as the sort of slightly sneering, smarmy, owning the college student kind of thing. But I think in many ways he matches the energy that he's given, and so taking him seriously and listening to what he's saying and being willing to concede a point to him, he will do the same thing. And I think that happened in this conversation. You know, it's steadfast. We're saying what we think to each other. At one point we both accuse each other simultaneously of being delusional. but in such a manner that if you say something, you get a sort of like, yeah, no, that's a fair point, actually, maybe we should put it this way instead, or yeah, actually, I see what you're saying, no, you're right, I should have said this instead. That kind of attitude, which is the kind of thing that people think Ben Shapiro is incapable of, for some reason.
Humility.
You know what I mean? Yeah, and it's a kind of, it's a hidden humility, because it comes out not in the attitude, not in a sort of, it's not going to like give way to you emotionally. It's not going to be like, oh, you're right. It would just be if you pay attention to the way he's constructing an argument and changing it subtly based on your responses, you know that he really is listening and really is trying to engage with what you're actually saying. And that's the kind of humility that I don't think can really be fake.
Yeah, I am friends with a bunch of guys that have worked with him over the years, and I know for a fine fact that part of his debate prep involves a number of break glass in case of mass offence sort of escape hatches, and that there's layers of how deep and how aggressive he can go. So I would love to know, actually I might email him and find out what he's got on you, just in case I ever need to actually pull that pin. But
he said to me when he walked in, I saw the Peter Hitchens thing, as everybody's been saying to me recently. So he'd at least seen that, so he knows how I behave, and he knows, in other words, that if he did start sort of screaming at me, that I would probably just sit there and take it.
Right, okay. Like the philosophical cuck that you are.
Quite right.
Yeah, you're kind of a little...
That's another quote for the Twitter bio, I think.
Yeah, have you updated it to I've decided I do not like you, Peter Hitchens?
It's in there somewhere. I think it's I actively dislike you is the quote that's now on my bio. I'm constantly shifting it around.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll ever get rid of unusually penetrating.
What was it that you did for a while? Making theists question their beliefs and lesbians question their sexualities.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I remember that in your bio.
I have no idea what you're talking about. To watch the full conversation, click the link that's on your screen. Subscribe to my main channel or this Glitch channel by clicking just below it. If you want to support my channel and get early access to videos, as well as getting them ad-free, then visit patreon.com/AlexOC. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
How much was that? Oh no. That could have been it. Alright, what else do we have with Alex O'Connor?
Cliff and Stuart.
Let's try this.
Show me a full glass of red wine. Here is an image of a full glass of red wine placed on a wooden table. No, I said a full glass of red wine. Here is an image of a completely full glass of red wine, filled to the very brim. Let me know if you'd like any further adjustments. Does that look like it's filled to the brim to you? You're right, it doesn't quite look like it's filled to the absolute brim. Let me try again and ensure the glass appears completely full, with the wine nearly overflowing at the edge. Here's a new version, with the glass of red wine filled completely to the brim, showing the surface tension holding the wine in place. Mate, that's still only half full. You're absolutely right again. Let me try once more to create an image of a glass completely filled to the brim, leaving no room for ambiguity. I'll ensure it looks like the wine is almost spilling over. Wow, that's a fun one. But the glass remains palpably, definitively, manifestly half full. You're absolutely right. Again, let's get it perfect this time. I'll ensure the glass is so full it leaves no doubt, with the wine literally on the verge of spilling over. Let me make it unmistakably filled to the brim. Here's the new attempt, featuring a glass of red wine undeniably filled to the very brim. Let me know if this finally hits the mark. You would make a terrible bartender. Touché. Clearly my glass filling skills could use some work. If you ever need someone to critique philosophy or make clickbait video titles instead, I'm your person. Touché indeed. Okay, what is going on? ChatGPT can show me a glass of wine with wings if I ask it to, but it can't show me one that's simply full to the brim? Why? Well, we have to understand how AI image generation works. If I ask ChatGPT to show me a horse, it doesn't actually know what a horse is. Instead, it's been trained on millions of images, each labelled with descriptions. When I ask for a horse, it looks at all of its training images labelled horse, identifies patterns, and takes an educated guess at the kind of image I want to see. And it's pretty good at it. It can then start combining concepts. So if I ask to see a horse in a swimming pool, well, it's never seen that before, but it has seen images of horses and images of swimming pools. So it can show me a horse in a swimming pool by just putting them together. So here's what seems to be the problem. When I ask ChatGPT for a glass of wine filled to the brim, its image generator checks all the images in its system. But here's the thing. When was the last time you saw a wine glass filled to the brim? I've never seen that before. It's just not how people pour wine. So there are probably barely any images of this in ChatGPT's dataset. And that's why it struggles to produce such an image. Now, you may think that this is just a language issue. Maybe ChatGPT assumes that in this context, full means normal drinking level. But even when I asked it to show me a random orange liquid in a wine glass up to the brim, without using the word full, it still couldn't do it. And comically, when I asked it for a wine glass overflowing with wine, it showed me the liquid overflowing through the middle of the glass. And it gets weirder, because this also works in the opposite direction. I asked for a glass of wine only a quarter full. It showed me a glass filled to a normal level. Then I asked for a wine glass only 1/10 full. I asked for one with a tiny drop of wine in it. Then I specifically asked for a tablespoon's worth of wine in a glass. Every single time, it failed. So it seems that ChatGPT can only produce a wine glass that's either completely empty or filled to a normal drinking level, but nothing in between and nothing more. And surprisingly, all of this might teach us something about the work of a famous philosopher from a few hundred years ago, whom you've probably heard of.
And that's this guy, David Hume, who was not only one of the most influential philosophers of the 18th century, but also provided the inspiration for this statue, allowing me to write this entire trip to Edinburgh off as a tax expense. Thank you, Mr. Hume.
You see, I'm all about saving money, and so allow me to provide you some great value for money too, if you don't mind. If you care at all about internet security or user data, then 3 cents a month, as well as getting 4 months extra for free. That said, back to David Hume. David Hume was an empiricist. An empiricist believes that all human knowledge ultimately comes from our observations or things that we experience with our senses. This is opposed to rationalists who think that knowledge can be innate without needing observation or experience. Let's see why Hume believed this. He begins his treatise of human nature by observing that all human thoughts seem to come in one of two kinds. He calls these impressions and ideas. Take a look at your hand. Right now, your mind is perceiving its shape, its colour, its size, and so on. Now close your eyes and just imagine your hand. Most of you can still see it in your head. Your mind is still perceiving its shape, its colour, its size, and so on, but only in a much fainter and less vivid sense than a moment ago. These are... Oh, you can open your eyes again, but these are the two kinds of mental perceptions that Hume defines. When you look at your hand, you're experiencing an impression, something which impresses itself upon you. When you imagine your hand, you're experiencing an idea. Ideas are weaker, more faded versions of impressions. And crucially for Hume, everything we think about always comes in these pairs. He writes, all perceptions of the mind are double and appear both as impressions and ideas. For example, you can't have an idea of red unless you first had an impression of red. That's why people blind from birth can't imagine colour. They have to come as a pair. Likewise, if you've ever heard the sound of a trumpet before, you can probably reconstruct that sound in your memory, making an idea out of that impression. Another pair. Now, you might ask, well, Mr. Hume, if ideas and impressions always come in pairs, how come I can have an idea of something which I've never seen, like a unicorn? Well, a unicorn is what Hume calls a complex idea. A complex idea is one that you can break down into parts. You may never have seen a unicorn, but you have seen a horse, and you have seen a horn, and you can kind of just stitch these together in your mind, and this creates a unicorn. But it's not just ideas which can be complex. Real-world impressions can be complex too. Hume's example is an apple. The impression of an apple is actually lots of different impressions. Its size, its shape, its colour, its taste, and so on, all bundled together. That makes it complex. But now just take the apple's green colour. This greenness can't be broken down into parts. It's just green. This is what Hume calls a simple perception, one that can't be broken down any further. So, complex ideas and impressions don't always have to come in identical pairs, but all simple ideas must have a corresponding simple
there was
impression.
again
And
a
since
very...
this is universal, it can't just be by chance. Hume concludes that one of these must cause the other, and since impressions always come before their corresponding ideas and never the other way around, Hume concludes that impressions must be the cause of ideas. And hey, take note, we've just arrived at what empiricism is. Empiricism is the idea that all of your knowledge is caused by your experience, and Hume says that all of our ideas are caused ultimately by impressions. Why have I told you all of this? Well, because if you think about it, ChatGPT thinks in a kind of similar way to Hume's empiricism.
300.
All of its ideas, like generating a horse, must be derived from its impressions, that is, its training data. And just like us, it can then take simple ideas and put them together to create complex ideas. That's how it can produce a horse in a swimming pool. And so I bring all of this up because maybe our AI wineglass situation might therefore be able to teach us something about Hume's empiricism. While AI systems may work very differently to human minds, they could still provide an instructive metaphor for understanding and testing Hume's ideas. Let's look further. Interestingly, David Hume admits that he can never exactly prove his theory that ideas always come from impressions. Why? Well, because you can't go through every single possible idea a person can have and check that it does indeed break down into some corresponding impression universally. Instead, Hume challenges skeptics of his view to find a single counterexample to disprove his theory. He writes, "But if anyone should deny this universal resemblance between impressions and ideas, I know no way of convincing him that by desiring him to show a simple impression that has not a correspondent idea, or a simple idea that has not a correspondent impression. If he does not answer this challenge, as is certain he cannot, we may from his silence and our own observation establish our conclusion." So, it's a challenge. If you think Hume is wrong, all you have to do to prove it is provide a single counterexample. Just show a single simple idea which has no corresponding impression. And Hume is certain it cannot be done. Except, unfortunately, there actually is a famous counterexample. Take a look at the colours on your screen. It's a scale from a dark shade of blue all the way up to a light shade of blue. But the shade in the middle is missing. Now, suppose somebody had never seen colour before. They had no prior experience of blue
When will you
whatsoever.
fucking...
If you showed them this scale, the question is this: would they be able to fill in the missing shade in their head without actually having to see it first? Most people intuitively think yes, but remember, for Hume, any particular colour is a simple idea. So here, it seems like somebody can imagine a simple idea, the missing shade of blue, without having had any corresponding impression of that shade of blue. So this seems to be a counterexample, proving that David Hume's empiricism is false. It's a really clever idea. Oh, and I forgot to tell you who came up with it. This counterexample comes from the work of an 18th century Scottish philosopher called David Hume. Yeah, and I'm not talking like years later or something. I mean like 2 pages later in the same text. Yes, Hume himself asks if such a person could imagine the missing shade of blue, and writes, "I believe there are few but will be of the opinion that he can, and this may serve as a proof that simple ideas are not always derived from the correspondent impressions." Wow, okay, so how does he respond to this? He continues, "Though the instance is so particular and singular that it's scarce worth our observing, and does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim." Yeah, that's right. Hume admits that it's a counterexample, but basically says that we should just ignore it because it's only a small one. Remember, viewer, that only 2 pages earlier, Hume challenged the reader to produce a single counterexample, and told us that it is certain he cannot. And here is Hume himself answering that challenge 2 pages later,
Hume was a funny
providing
guy,
a
I guess.
counterexample and just telling us to ignore it. This, broadly speaking, tends to baffle readers of David Hume. It appears to be a blatant contradiction. Now, you might have already thought of a solution for Hume. Many people, when they hear this, say, well, yeah, you could imagine the missing shade of blue, but it wouldn't really be a simple idea. It would be a complex idea, made up of the other shades either side, sort of mixed together. That's a fine suggestion, but weirdly, Hume himself offers no such explanation. He just admits that it is
That
a
wasn't
counterexample to
hard.
empiricism. And to
Really
most readers,
hard
the existence of such a counterexample
version.
should be enough to disprove a theory. But Hume just tells us to ignore it. But what if Hume was just wrong about this? What if most of us are wrong? I mean, most people assume, like Hume, that yeah, we could fill in the missing shade. Why wouldn't we be able to? But then most people also assume that ChatGPT could fill in the gap between an empty and a half-full glass of wine. But it can't. Could these situations be related? Last month, I got a text from Joe Foley of Unsolicited Advice, shout out Joe, about this AI wine problem. He said, made me think of the missing shade of blue. And yeah, maybe there's something in this. Could this tell us that we shouldn't be so confident in assuming that a person with no prior experience of colour could fill in the gap with the missing shade of blue? It may seem intuitive, but we've never actually tested it. Well, this gave me an idea. Why don't we just test it using ChatGPT?
What if you, like... Some people cannot differentiate between like green and blue. Like Japanese, they have one word for blue and for green. What if you show them like 2 different shades of green, or 2 different shades of green? They actually have a word for green, but it's not that common, and they do tend to refer to green things as blue, aoi, right? Yeah. So what if you show them like 2 shades, or let's say 6 shades, yeah, that are very close to each other, so close that they wouldn't even be able to tell the difference with their eyes? Will they be able to fill the gap? On the other hand, remember there's this tribe somewhere in Africa or whenever, and they have like name for 20 different shades of green. They would definitely be able to do that. But that's because they paid attention. And let's say a painter or a web designer might also be able to do that. See the difference between the shades and then pick the correct one. But it's because they have experience of actually watching the colors and thinking about them and all that.
Obviously, ChatGPT does have every conceivable shade of blue in its dataset, but I asked it to simply remove one shade of blue from its dataset and then see if it could reproduce that shade of blue just by looking at the other shades. ChatGPT told me that it can't actually alter its dataset, but it can simulate this experiment by generating a gradient of blue shades, then removing a single shade from the gradient, and then only using the rest of the gradient try to fill in the gap. Even better, afterwards, it can then compare the shade it imagined with the actual shade it previously removed and see how accurate it was. Crucially, I also requested that it doesn't refer to numbers, so no maths, no using hex codes or equivalent. It then ran this experiment, and sure enough, it generated a shade of blue identical to the actual shade it previously removed. So, ChatGPT could imagine the missing shade of blue just by looking at the shades surrounding it. This means that the counterexample is legitimate, and that empiricism fails, right? Not so fast.
This is a clip.
The crucial question
This
is how
is a clip.
ChatGPT filled in the gap. ChatGPT told me that this is what it did. To estimate the missing shade, I visually blended the 2 closest shades around it. Visually blended. It didn't just fill in the gap exactly, but instead it mixed together the 2 shades on either side. This shows that while Hume was correct that the missing shade could be imagined, he was wrong, at least in this case, to assume that the shade imagined would be a simple idea. ChatGPT has clearly here produced a complex idea, a mixture of two other ideas, two other shades, put together. So no, this doesn't disprove empiricism. All it does is disprove that the missing shade of blue is a legitimate counterexample, since Hume's challenge was for us to show a simple idea without a corresponding impression. ChatGPT has come up with a complex idea. So this solution to the missing shade of blue counterexample, one I alluded to earlier, of just taking other shades and mixing them together, does seem to work. And while it is bizarre that David Hume didn't come up with such a solution himself and didn't even try to, the fact that he contradicts himself doesn't mean that his ideas were necessarily wrong. It just means that he failed to properly and fully defend them. However, ChatGPT has perhaps provided us with a more complicated replacement for the missing shade of blue. The missing volume of wine. And this might be a more informative challenge too. While the former is about perceptual continuity and can be solved by just blending adjacent ideas together to fill in the gap, this new problem seems to be more about conceptual abstraction. Can we make sense of the impressions that we're observing? Now, bear in mind that for us, a glass of wine is a complex impression made up of lots of parts. But ChatGPT never sees the wine glass get filled up. It just sees the completed image all at once. And so it seems to be treating images of wine glasses as a whole as simple impressions, not complex impressions as they appear to us. Well, okay, even if these are simple impressions, why can't ChatGPT then just combine the image of the empty glass and the image of the normally filled glass to produce a complex impression of a quarter-filled glass of wine? Well, I think it's because, crudely, if you just mix together an image of an empty wine glass and an image of a normally filled glass, let's do it on Photoshop right now, you don't get a quarter-full glass of wine. Instead, you get a wine glass with a ghostly, half-visible serving of wine to a normal level, but only at 50% opacity. And that's why, if we're treating the empty wine glass and the normally filled wine glass as simple impressions, an observer, be it us or ChatGPT, likely requires more than just the ability to combine visuals in order to produce the desired quarter-filled glass of wine. It has to also make some kind of sense of what it sees. And that's why I say that this problem is less about just plugging in a gap like the missing shade of blue, and instead more about conceptual abstraction. And for that reason, if you ask me, much more interesting. ChatGPT does seem to behave in a Humean fashion. So to find out if human beings function in the same way, we might ask the following question. Suppose a human being had never seen liquids or receptacles before. If such a person saw an image of an empty wine glass and an image of a wine glass filled to a normal level, could that person, based only on these data, imagine a glass of wine a quarter of the way full with wine? The prior experimental conditions necessary for this kind of calculation are so convoluted that it's actually really difficult to consider the question. I'm genuinely not sure what the answer is, but interestingly, ChatGPT might function a bit like a parody of David Hume's empiricism. This is what you would end up with if that's how thinking actually worked. Something like ChatGPT and an inability to imagine a glass of wine filled to the brim. And maybe that just is how a human being would also react if you genuinely managed to kit them in that very specific set of circumstances. But if you think that a human could imagine the missing volume of wine in that specific set of circumstances, and that seems kind of plausible to me, then perhaps this is because humans can just naturally abstract concepts in a way that ChatGPT simply can't. And perhaps we've learned something interesting from this. While ChatGPT may well behave like the perfect Humean thinker, maybe human minds just work differently. Or look, maybe you think that these concepts aren't related at all, and I'm totally wrong to be raising this comparison. But at the very least, you have to admit that this glass of wine business is at least an interesting example of ChatGPT's cognitive failings. However, of course, whether this example is so particular and singular that it is scarce worth our observing is up to you to decide. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Great video. What else do we have here? I guess.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and my most popular
Hello,
video by
kid.
far has been my response to the homophobic Jehovah's Witness cartoon. So I think it's about time we did a part 2. But this time, it's not a cartoon. It's actually live action, and just by the camera quality and the production value of this guy's content, you can tell that he means business.
Okay. My thoughts on homosexuality and why I think the shit needs to be completely eradicated.
Okay, so you want to eradicate homosexuality. Well, there are 2 ways that you can go about doing that. The first is to take people who are homosexuals and stop them from being homosexuals, which is impossible because you can't control your sexuality. It would be a bit like me trying to eradicate your heterosexuality. It just wouldn't work. So the only other option would be mass genocide, which admittedly is more attainable in principle, but still not particularly favourable, is it? So which is it? Is it the impossibility or the mass genocide?
First and foremost, the shit is not normal.
Define normal. According to the dictionary definition, normal is conforming to a standard, usual, typical, or expected. So if we look at nature, look at the animal kingdom, homosexuality is rife. It's everywhere. I'm talking baboons, I'm talking giraffes and zebras and lions, pretty much everywhere across the animal kingdom. The only thing that's not normal across the animal kingdom is homophobia. So if anything,
I'm not sure that wasn't completely free.
is National Geographic.
Well, I guess that spam on 4 times speed was something.
Homosexuality seems rampant.
Oh no.
And for the most part, homosexual animals appear to experience very little hostility.
Why
The
Chinese?
response is positive. In fact, among certain species, homosexuality is more common in those
Why?
individuals with status.
You can't create, so if you're not creating anything, you're destroying something.
You're forgetting one key aspect here, my friend, and that is not everything has to be productive. You ever heard of fun? I mean, well, personally, having sex with another guy wouldn't be particularly fun for me, because I'm straight. But if it's
Too
fun for
bad.
other people, they should be able to do it. You know what else isn't productive and doesn't create anything? Playing video games, going out with your friends, going on dates, but you do them anyway because they're fun. Not everything has to be in order to produce something, to create life. Also, I have a question for you. Now, I don't know if you're in a relationship or not, but let's say that you were, and let's say that you want to have children at some point down the line, which quite evidently you do. What would you do if you or your partner was infertile? If you and your partner aren't capable of making babies, and therefore you're not creating anything, you're not being productive, does that also mean that you should be eradicated and that you're not normal and unnatural? I don't think so.
And I think the shit is a sickness because every time a man let another man stick his penis in his ass, you're sick, something is wrong with you. I think that shit need to be on the same platform as like a pedophile, a sex offender, or some shit like that.
What?
What?
So let me get this straight. You think that 2 consenting adults having sex in the privacy of their own home should be on the same level as somebody raping a child? I hope you can see how illogical that is. If not, then I have a serious question for you. Let's say that you have a daughter. Now, would you rather that this daughter had a girlfriend when she was 21 or was raped by a man when she was 6? Because according to your logic, those 2 would have about equal weight. Whereas according to my logic, I definitely prefer the first.
That shit is completely sick. This people insane.
I would attempt to point out the irony of calling
My
insane
hand.
after comparing consensual homosexual sex to child rape, but I don't think
Cool
you'd be
video.
intelligent enough to acknowledge it.
You know, it's not just the man, it's the woman too.
Oh, that's alright then, I was getting worried for a second.
And we ain't saying y'all hoes neither. It's off with your head.
Oh, okay, so it's the genocide then. It's off with your head.
I love
My
him.
friend, you just called for the mass genocide of all homosexuals via decapitation. I hope you realise that. I was beginning to feel sorry for you because you're so stupid. I was beginning to empathise with your lack of intelligence.
Oh my
You
God.
called for the death of a significant portion of the human population for something that they can't control. Homosexuality isn't a choice. They didn't choose to be gay as much as you or I didn't choose to be straight. And if you don't believe me, I can prove it with a simple challenge. If you think homosexuality is a choice, why don't you choose to be gay for a week and see how that turns out? And except of course you can't, because it's not a choice, it's not something that you can control. So what that means is that you just expressed a condonement for the mass genocide of a specific group of people for nothing more than an intrinsic part of their character that they can't control.
Oh no.
I don't know where I've heard this before. I can't put my finger on it. I'm sure I've heard it before somewhere. But regardless of all that, I have something just for you. Here is an exclusive, unprecedented top tip from your pal Al. If you want to change the minds of people regarding certain subjects, you're coming on a bit too strong.
What? I was too
A good way
slow.
to change people's opinions is you first have to entertain their pre-existing notions and explain why they're not feasible. Once you've done that, you can offer some alternatives and talk through those as well, saying why some might work and why some wouldn't. And then you express your own opinion,
Alright.
explaining why you think
That
it
was
would
cool,
work
but what I
best.
wanna try
This
is-
is how you effectively and intelligently attempt to
What
change
the
people's
fuck?
minds. Unfortunately, jumping
Nice
straight to
computer.
excommunication and mass genocide is not a great way to go about it. Also, I don't know if anyone's told you this before, but you're a massive hypocrite.
my
You see, I
God.
know that this isn't the only video that you've uploaded to YouTube.
Trail,
You've got another video
trail,
called My
trail.
Views on Black
Why
Liberation,
is it so big?
which is an incredibly interesting watch, having just seen what
Little
we've just
one.
seen.
But the key and the foundation of black liberation is we
Oh my
must
God.
love each other. We lack love. We do not love each other. You can do business with this black man, but you don't love this black man. We have to kill a nigga mentality. If we don't kill a nigga mentality, we will not go forward as a nation. We will never strive. We don't love each other.
I'm a bit.
Love is the key to solving our problems. We don't love each other. We kill each other. We hurt each other.
Not
we hate on
used.
each other.
And all I can say about
The
that
camera.
video is that you, sir, are completely right. We have to love each other. That's the only way that we're going to progress as a civilization. So why in the holiest of all hells are you condoning the mass genocide of homosexuals? Just think about this for a second. In your video about black liberation, you're angry because people are discriminating against a certain group of people because of something that they can't control. And you think that the only way that we can conquer that is by love. You then make a video discriminating against a certain group of people for something that they can't control and say that they should be put to death. Where is the logic in that? In most response videos that I make, I try and include something educational that people can take away from the video, but in this case, all I can really conclude is that you're an idiot. You're actually really, really stupid, and there's not really much that I think anyone can do about it. It's not just that you're stupid because you have stupid opinions. You're stupid because you have stupid opinions, which you then completely contradict with other opinions. It doesn't really get much more stupid than that. So I'm pretty much going to have to leave it there and end the video. But in conclusion, you're pretty cute. Hit me up, we can go on a date or something. And for the rest of you, I've been Alex O'Connor. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
This camera fucking sucks, I'ma tell you that much. How cute sounding. No wonder. Nords are smarter. Smarter. Difficult word. What other funny videos are there? What is the worst religion? Where is that video about homosexuality? Alright.
Hey guys, it's Cosmic Skeptic, and I was recently sent a video which has been going around on Facebook, and the caption says, "This guy might have just proved in one video that God actually exists," which of course took my interest. Then I saw saw that the video's got around 1.5 million views, so I realised it's definitely something that I wanted to respond to. So you might have seen this one going around yourself and had your own thoughts. I'm not sure, but let's just get into it, shall we?
My name is Cherry Clark. You know what I like? Galaxy. You know what a galaxy looks like? You know what a hurricane looks like? A seashell. You know what a seashell looks like? Your ear. Did you know that you resemble a galaxy?
Well, yeah, actually, and it makes quite a lot of sense when you think about it, because if everything was designed, then you'd expect that the universe and everything in it would have its own unique mathematical and physical makeup. Whereas if everything came about by nature, you'd expect that they'd all abide by some kind of physical and mathematical law, which you just pointed out that they do.
1.618 is known as the golden ratio, a mathematical value that is found throughout the universe that seems to hint towards a common factor between everything, the fingerprint of God.
I've actually heard this quite a few times before, referring to this golden
sucks.
ratio at 1.62.
I'm back.
But the thing is that this argument is only really an argument at all
Is that
if there was
the
some
same
kind of
suit?
benefit for everything to have similar mathematic properties, which there isn't. We gain absolutely no benefit from the fact that the mathematical properties of the galaxy are similar to that of our thumbprints. It doesn't do anything for us. And again, all you've really done is point out the fact that there are certain mathematical and physical properties which underlie the universe we live in, which in turn implies a naturalistic evolution of such properties.
You know what a fingerprint looks like? The top of your head, inside the head of cabbage. It seems that both your head and the head of cabbage were designed, perfectly, mathematically designed. But that would imply a design. Is there a God?
Okay,
thought
so
I
a baby's
was
hair
dead.
kind of looks like a cabbage.
I'm
Well, I'll
back
be
to-
damned, there must be a god. What?
Well, the atoms in your body are traceable to exploded stars in the sky. So physicist Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson said that not only are you in the universe, but the universe is in you. You are literally stardust. The law of conservation of matter states that matter can be changed from one form to another. Mixtures can be separated or made, and pure substances can be decomposed. But the total amount of mass remains constant. In other words, the total mass of the universe is constant. Whenever matter undergoes a change, the total mass of the product of that change is the same as it was in the beginning.
What about when Jesus fed the 5,000? Where did all the extra massive food come from?
In fact, it is scientifically law, a fact, that your body mass has been here since the beginning of the universe. You are 13.8 billion years old. The time you spent here on Earth is just how long you've been aware of your existence.
Okay, two things. Firstly, the fact that the atoms that make us up have been around since the universe began is probably untrue, by the way. It was probably created in the supernova a bit later. But even if it was, that wouldn't imply that there was a god. That would just have the same bearing as saying that the planets and the atoms that make up the planets and the stars have been around since the beginning of the universe. It doesn't mean anything.
Oh, no.
Secondly, no, we haven't been around since the universe began. That would be the same as me saying that this book has been around since the birth of the tree from which was made this paper. That's not how it works. Also,
no,
doesn't
that's
the
right.
idea of us having been around since the
That's
universe's
right.
inception kind of contradict religious scripture which says that the earth was created, then man?
But in actuality, you have been here since God said, let there be
Yeah,
light.
so
You
much
said it
worse.
with him.
Well, according to this Bible, we were actually created 23 verses after God said that.
Are you God? Are you God?
Well, I'm about as much of a god as Jesus would have been if he actually existed, so by the Christian logic, I guess you could say that.
Speaking of God,
Wait, which one? Oh, you mean the one that belongs to the religious doctrine that you happen to have been brought up with? Okay, got it.
did you know that there are about 20 numbers that dictate the state of this universe? The
What?
mass of an electron, the strength of gravity, electromagnetic force, numbers that create our universe. World-renowned physicist Dr. Brian Greene says that these numbers have been measured with incredible precision, but no one has an explanation as to why they have the particular values that they do.
Well, the simple answer is you're absolutely right, and if the numbers had have been any different and humankind never came into existence, then we wouldn't be here to ask the question in the first place.
He says that if any one of these numbers were altered in even the slightest way, our entire universe would cease to exist. Our universe has been designed, perfectly, mathematically designed, without the entire design. Is there a God?
The reason
I
that
would
these
say
properties are so
unintelligently
well adjusted
designed.
for the universe as we know it today is because if they were adjusted in any other way, then it wouldn't be the universe as we know it today. It would be some kind of different universe, which we may have evolved in, we may not have, who knows. But if we hadn't have done, then we just wouldn't have been around to ask the question. And if the universe had have turned out any differently to how it did, then there'd probably be some other kind of life on some other kind of planet asking itself the same questions.
You ever felt like you were being watched, stared at? Did you turn around and see, yup, that weird guy 6 tables away was indeed staring at you? How did you know that? Could this be proof that there is some other medium by which information can be received other than the 5 senses? Do you see dead people? Probably not,
Well, as it happens, the human eye has a brilliant contrast between the pupils of the eye and the whiteness of the eye, which means it's really easy for us to discern which way someone's looking. So if somebody happens to be looking at you and you don't happen to be looking back, your peripheral vision will actually find it incredibly difficult not to pick up on that, and that gives you the feeling that you're kind of being watched without actually looking and seeing that you're being watched.
You do think about that person that you haven't talked to a month, and then suddenly they call your phone. You do dream about things before they happen. You do speak about people, and then they just pop up.
But how often does that actually happen? I mean, sure, it does happen quite a lot. I've experienced it myself. But I think about a lot of people, a lot of the time, whether it be people I've just spoken to or people I need to speak to, old friends who I haven't seen in a while, the likelihood that at least one point in my life, or a few points in my life, that one of these people will happen to call me within the week or so that I've been thinking about them, it seems inevitable. And on top of that, you don't count all the times that you think about people and they don't contact you, so it's a bit of an unfair analysis really. So yeah, it's a pretty uncanny phenomenon, but I'm not the first person to point out that it can actually be relatively easily explained away.
You have created things out of sound. Speaking of which, did you know that if you take a plate of salt and play certain sound frequencies at it, that the vibrations will cause the salt to form into perfect geometric shapes? These are pictures of sand created by simply exposing them to strong sound vibrations. Words can literally manipulate the matter around you.
But it isn't the words that do that, is it? You have to play a certain tone if you want to achieve some of the shapes that you've just displayed there. It's about the physics of the sound wave rather than the content of the voice.
This is a picture of jars of rice after 27 days of speaking to them. The jar on the right, people only said I love you to it. The jar on the left, people only said I hate you to it. And thus, the I hate you jar moved astoundingly quicker.
Okay, I would really quite like to see the scientific methodology that went into that.
These are pictures of ice crystals. The bottom row is spoken to positively as they froze. The top row is spoken to negatively as they froze. These are the results.
Hang on a second, why is heavy metal bad? It's not intrinsically evil or anything, it's just a genre of music. And in fact, heavy metal music has a completely different type of sound to the softer things that you might associate with music. So it's pretty easy to see that if these formations were affected by sound, it would have been due to the volume and the thrashiness of the sound, rather than the lyrics of the sound. Come on.
You can speak your world into existence. There is power in your word. John 1:1 from the King James Version of the Bible says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Wait, so now you're quoting the Bible? The same Bible that completely refutes many of the things that you said in this video, like the fact that the universe is 13.8 billion years old.
You are 13.8 billion years old.
String theory postulates that the entire universe, including me, you, and this screen that you're looking at me on, is composed of microscopic vibrating strings of pure energy. Sound. Words spoken in a language that we don't fully understand.
You know what string theory also postulates? The multiverse theory, which again contradicts the Bible.
Living words. You are the living word.
And yeah, string theory is based upon the idea of little vibrating strings that make up everything in the universe. But as far as I'm aware, there's been no scientific research to suggest that these little strings are making audible sounds that say things like, I hate gay people, and you can only be saved through me. I mean, not yet, anyway. You never know, do you?
Are you God? If so, nice to meet you. I love you.
What did you just do?
But yeah, so what you've done in this video is point out the fact that there's a bunch of mathematical and physical laws which govern the universe that we live in. But I would say that this actually disproves the idea of intelligent design rather than proves it. Why would an intelligent designer restrict themselves from designing specific individual things with unique and appropriate building blocks, and instead vouch for building everything with the same building blocks, even though this can be a detriment to some of the things
Let's try
that
now.
they're trying to design? And I guess the last word should be that
Aggressive.
even if this video did prove that there was some kind of intelligence behind the universe, that wouldn't then in turn prove that this intelligence was the God of the Bible or the God of the Quran. It just means that there was some kind of arbitrary movement behind the universe. And if it isn't the God of the Bible or the God of the Quran, then it really doesn't have that much of an effect on our lives anyway. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with the caption of this video. Sorry. But anyway, something completely unrelated just before I end the video. I'm incredibly close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, which is really cool, but I'm going to talk about that more in my next video.
Congrats.
The next video is going to be a Q&A, because I kind of said that I'd
You
do
call
that
this
when I hit
aggressive
10,000
speed changers.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and there seems to be a few more of you here than there was when I last sat behind this camera. So, hello and welcome to all freaking 5,000 of you. I'm going to talk about this ridiculous expansion at the end of the video, but first, a little while ago, I came across this guy's video and I thought I'd make a response. Of course, this was before I had my little growth. So I asked you guys on Twitter if you still think that I should make a response to this guy, and you pretty much unanimously said yes. I also realised that the things that this man's saying in his video are things that I, as an atheist, hear quite commonly. So this person's video is actually part of a series of videos that he's making. I think he's making 10 of them. A simple question, each video is quite short, in which he challenges atheists to answer the questions in order to convert them to atheism. Now, of course, to someone like me, this is a bit of a godsend, if you'll pardon the pun. So I decided to make a response to the latest video that this guy put up. But this video isn't meant to be just a response to this guy specifically. I want to use this as an opportunity to talk more broadly about this teleological argument.
Hello, atheists. Welcome back to the Convert Me to Atheism challenge. Now, in my video today, I want to discuss something. I want to ask you the question, why is our universe so finely tuned?
So finely tuned for what? Of course, according to the biblical narrative, we humans, mankind, is made in the image of God, which would imply that the whole universe and everything in it is kind of made for our purposes. Now, I've personally always thought this to be quite an arrogant view, but it's pretty much universal across modern faith. But if you're claiming that the universe is finely tuned for humans, it's anything but. You probably have a stronger argument if you ask why the Earth is so finely tuned for humans, which it still isn't really. But on a cosmological scale, the vast majority of this universe is completely uninhabitable. We couldn't last 5 seconds pretty much anywhere other than Earth in the entire cosmos. And I pretty much fail to understand why an intelligent designer would design a universe which is pretty much built to kill us within seconds. But hey, I guess God works in mysterious ways, right?
Now, I want you to imagine, we're walking down this beach here. You and me are walking down this beach here, and we see in the sand some ripples. And you say to me, hey Joe, how did those ripples get in the sand? And I say to you, oh, it was the waves that did it. And you say, okay, yeah, I can take that, that's cool, that's pretty cool. Okay, I want you to imagine we walk a little bit further down the beach, and you see in the sand it says, John loves Mary. And you say, hey Joe, how did that get into the sand? And I say to you, oh yeah, it was the waves again, the waves did that.
That was too tough.
Are you gonna believe me?
But very cool, satisfying.
You're not, are you? Because you know that nature cannot create something so finely tuned in such a small area, can it?
Okay, so this is an argument that I'm sure that many of the people watching have heard before, although it does usually come in the form of a watch, like finding a pocket watch on a beach or in a forest, and instantly realising that it must have been man-made, it can't have been created by nature because it's just too perfect. But the thing about a watch, and by extension the words John loves Mary written in the sand, is that they're clearly created in a top-down fashion. There's a designer who makes a design and then executes that design and actually physically makes it. In contrast to evolution, and I don't just mean biological evolution, I mean evolution of the stars and the planets in the universe, is bottom-up. It started off really simply, and then through a process of what could be described as cosmological trial and error, evolved into the universe that we see today. As an example, you may note that there are billions of planets in the universe, most of which are pretty much perfectly orbiting their stars at speeds which don't cause them to spiral in and eventually be destroyed by their stars. And it is tempting to ask, how are the laws of physics so perfect that these planets can happily orbit their stars? But if you think about it, if the laws of physics were different, then these planets would have just spiraled in and been destroyed by their stars. And instead we'd see slightly slower moving planets which would have had too much speed to be orbiting their stars, and you'd be asking the same question about so I think a more fitting analogy, if you want to employ imagery of a beach, is to imagine that you were on a really stony beach with stones as far as the eye can see in either direction. Now imagine you happen to come across a stone which seems perfect for skimming. You pick it up and it's perfectly flat and perfectly circular, and you think to yourself, how can this stone exist so perfectly? It must have had some kind of intelligent design. And again, this is quite a tempting conclusion to come to, but think for a minute, look around you and you'll see that there are tons of stones on the floor, most of which are just boulder like normal stones, but some are quite similar to the skimming stone, just maybe not perfectly circular or a bit too fat. And so you'd probably think to yourself that just given the sheer amount of stones and the amount of variety among them, that the likelihood of finding at least one example of a perfect skimming stone is pretty much inevitable. And yes, of course, it's still pretty unlikely that you'd just happen to come across that stone, but if you hadn't have done, then well, you wouldn't have thought to ask the question in the first place. So in the same respect, it might be difficult to imagine that our planet just happened to have the perfect conditions for life, but it has to, because if it didn't, then life wouldn't have formed here to ask the question in the first place. I'm sure that if it didn't, then probably somewhere else in the universe, life would have and probably has formed that maybe grew intelligent enough to ask itself the same question. I don't see why we can't just accept that we're incredibly lucky individuals to be at the end of a long evolutionary chain which took place on a planet with conditions perfect for its existence. Because to me that's an incredibly spiritual realization, more so than I ever got from my years of being a Christian.
Let me ask you this, atheists. Why is it that boiling point is always 100°C? It never goes higher, it's always 100°C. It never fluctuates, it never goes down.
Okay.
We called it 100.
Two things. Firstly, if by this question you mean how is it that the boiling point of water just happens to fall upon 100 degrees Celsius perfectly, that's because that's how we define the scale. The Celsius scale, although originally devised the other way round, is defined by the freezing point of water at 0 degrees and the boiling point of water at 100 degrees. But secondly, that's just not true. Boiling point is entirely dependent on the air pressure surrounding a substance. The lower the air pressure, the lower the boiling point. For instance, if you were on top of Mount Everest, where the air pressure is a lot lower, the boiling point of water would only be around 71 degrees Celsius.
Why is it that this sea here will have a limit and it'll never ever go past that? Why does the sea never go past its limit?
Because that limit was created by the sea. It's the water that eroded the rock away which created the barrier in the first place.
Why is it if we were just 1 inch closer, just 1 inch closer to our sun, that we would completely fry?
Okay, this is something that I hear quite a lot, and I think it's about time we cleared this up. Go outside and locate the sun. Now, take a step towards it.
I'm not sure
You've
this
just
is...
moved multiple inches towards
That
the
was
sun.
100 meters, I never
Yet
thought
there's no
about it.
noticeable difference, right?
Never thought
It's the
it's time
exact
to
same
lock
thing
in.
for the Earth. The sun is a very long way away. Think about how fast light travels. Like when you turn on a light, how long it takes for light to leave the bulb and hit your eye. Now imagine how far that light could travel if you gave it 8 entire minutes to travel in a straight line. That's how far away the sun is. So if the distance between the Earth and the sun was the distance between London and New York, 1 inch would be less than the width of a human hair. So imagine this for a second. Imagine there's somebody in New York and you're in London, and you want to hear what they're saying. And obviously you can't hear them because you're all the way over in London. So in order to hear them better, you move yourself closer to New York by the width of a human hair. It would make absolutely no difference. You still wouldn't be able to hear them at all. In the same respect, moving closer or further away from the sun by these distances has absolutely no effect on our planet. So that's a purely logical way of thinking about it, but if you want to get a bit more scientific, we have to understand Kepler's first law of planetary motion, which states that planets don't orbit their stars in perfect circle. They orbit in ellipses, meaning that at some points in the orbit it's slightly fatter and at some points it's slightly thinner. What this means is that by varying degrees, pretty much all planets, including the Earth, change their orbital distance from their star as they orbit around it. And so due to this elliptical orbit, not only does the Earth's orbital distance vary by a few inches, it actually varies by millions of kilometers throughout the year. I think around...
Alright, that was fun, but I'm done, guys. Goodbye.